What if an angel revealed to humankind the kind of knowledge they were never meant to know? Imagine, for a moment, the quiet of the night, the stars scattered above in endless silence, and beneath them a world unaware of what is about to unfold. In that stillness, a single choice is made, and that choice changes the course of history forever. This is the story of Azazel, a name whispered in the pages of the Ethiopian Enoch, a name bound to shadows and secrets that still echo across time. The tale begins in a world untouched by war as we know it, a world where the skies were open and the earth was innocent. Angels looked upon the children of men, and among them was Azazel. Unlike the others, his gaze was sharp, his mind filled with mysteries hidden from human eyes. To him, the boundaries between the divine and the earthly were fragile, threads that could be crossed, broken, or twisted. While others watched quietly, Azazel chose to step closer, to bring forbidden things into human hands. The Book of Enoch, preserved most fully in the Ethiopian tradition, holds his story with a kind of weight that feels heavy even as it is read in the calm of night. It tells us not of a simple fall, but of a deliberate act, an angel reaching down, offering gifts that looked beautiful at first, but carried ruin inside them. The way the text describes him, Azazel is not simply a rebel, he is a teacher, one who shares with humanity what they should never have known. It is the difference between a candle and a wildfire, knowledge that lights the way and knowledge that consumes. And so, imagine the slow unfolding of this moment. A single angel walks among mortals, showing them how to shape metal into swords, how to carve edges sharp enough to pierce the skin, how to make ornaments that dazzle the eyes but stir pride and desire in the heart. What once was simple becomes complicated. What once was toy, as innocent becomes tainted. The story of Azazel is not only about him, it is about us, about the way knowledge changes the world and how fragile the line is between wisdom and destruction. The Ethiopian Enoch preserves these stories as if guarding a memory long forgotten by the rest of the world. In its pages, the story does not feel distant. It feels near, as though one could close their eyes and see the desert where Azazel's fate would be sealed, or hear the voices of the archangels pleading for the earth to be cleansed. The writing is vivid, filled with imagery that lingers like a dream. You can almost sense the heaviness of the moment when the heavens decide what must be done with Azazel, and yet for now, we stand at the beginning. Let the sound of this tale wash over you like a soft wind. Picture the world before the flood, before the chaos, before humanity had tasted what it was never meant to taste. This is where we stand at the start of our journey, the place where the boundary was broken. Azazel's story begins not with thunder, but with whispers. Whispers of secrets, whispers of beauty, whispers of power. It is almost like the beginning of a lullaby, one that carries with it a haunting melody. As we step into the heart of the Ethiopian Enoch, we see not only the fall of one angel, but the unraveling of the earth itself. Yet even in this, there is calm. The way the tale moves is slow, steady, as though meant to be listened to in the quiet of the night. Each detail settles like dust in the air. Each word feels as though it could drift into your dreams. And in this stillness, we hear the question once more. What if an angel gave us what we should never have touched? The story we are about to unfold is not rushed. It is meant to be heard gently, step by step, like waves lapping at the shore. We will see Azazel not only in his rise, but in his fall, in his teachings and in his chains, in the way his name became tied forever to sin and shadow. This is not just the tale of a being cast down. It is the memory of how fragile the human heart is and how easily it can be led astray by beauty, by power, by the promise of more. And so we begin, slowly, as if drifting into a dream. Close your eyes if you wish, let your breath steady, and picture the earth in its first days. The skies are vast, the rivers run clear, the nights are filled with stars untouched by pollution or noise. Into this world comes Azazel, carrying the secrets of heaven in his hands. The night grows heavy, the silence deepens, and the weight of forbidden knowledge hangs like a veil over creation. This is the beginning of the story, the fall of Azazel as told in the Ethiopian Enoch. It is a story that winds through shadows, through deserts, through the cries of angels and the judgment of heaven. But it is also a story that asks us to pause, to breathe, and to listen. For in its quiet telling, we may feel the stillness of eternity pressing softly upon our hearts. And before we drift further, let me gently ask you, if you are finding peace in these words, if you wish to walk with me through the entire story, help us grow together. Subscribe to this channel, share this journey with others, and leave your name and city in the comments so we know where you are listening from. Links to the Ethiopian Bible with its 88 books and the complete Book of Enoch are waiting for you below. May these ancient words bring you closer to wisdom, and may Jesus grant you reward for every moment you spend here in remembrance. Enoch lived in a world that was both quiet and restless, where the whispers of heaven touched the ground. People were still young, communities were small, and families told stories by the fire at night under the wide sky. The stars above looked closer and brighter, like heaven itself was leaning down to listen. Something amazing happened during this time that would change history and leave behind shadows remembered in old writings. The Watchers were some of the most mysterious beings of that time. They were angels with a job to do, and their job was to watch but never get involved. They were beautiful, shining beings that mortals had never seen before. It felt like each winged figure held secrets of creation itself, and their presence was heavy. They stood apart for a long time, watching people from above, unseen but always watching. But inside them grew a stirring, a desire that should never have grown. The world below is full of life and beauty, and in that beauty they saw both wonder and temptation. The Ethiopian Book of Enoch says that 200 of these angels came down from their heavenly posts. They didn't come down as quiet observers. They came down as people who had made a deal. It wasn't just one weak decision. It was a promise made by everyone, sealed in unity, and spoken with voices that echoed off the mountains. They picked Mount Hermon as their meeting place. It was a huge mountain with slopes that reached the sky and winds that howled through the rocks like old songs. They made a promise to each other there, under the stars. The oath was strong and could not be broken. Every angel promised that they would not change their minds about what they had chosen. They would come down to earth, marry the daughters of men, and tell people the secrets that heaven had kept hidden. Mount Hermon's silence, which was heavy with dread, bore witness to this vow. The name of the mountain would be linked to their binding, which would be remembered as the serious promise that was never meant to be made. Azazel was one of them, and his name would stand out the most. He wasn't just one of the 200. He had a fire in him, a desire to lead, to act, and to make the impossible happen. He was not afraid to be on that mountain. Some people may have been scared and shaken by the weight of their choice, but Azazel stood strong, his eyes shining with determination. He had a restless energy in him and a will that pushed others forward when they were about to give up. The Watchers didn't make their choice in a moment of fleeting passion. They made a careful agreement because they knew that once they crossed the line, there would be no going back. They kept going, though. The earth below seemed to call to them. The daughters of men were beautiful, and the secrets of creation were waiting to be revealed. The stars watched in silence as these 200 angels chained themselves together in protest. Azazel played a key role. He gave them strength when others failed. When they were unsure, he spoke words that made them stronger. His voice rang out clearly in the night, telling his friends to follow their hearts and let go of their fears. He was not just part of the vow, he was its heart and soul. His leadership was not forced, it came from the strength of his will. People who might have broken the oath were held by his certainty, which was stronger than their own promises. Picture that moment on Mount Hermon, when the night was cold but full of the weight of eternity. The angels stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices blending into one. They were bright and scared, and at the center of it all was Azazel, who was not looking up at the heavens he had left but down at the earth he wanted to claim. The deal was done, and the Watchers were no longer protectors from above. They were now travelers on the path of disobedience. People down below still didn't know what had happened. Res flickered in the dark, and kids slept in their mother's arms. Life went on as usual under the wide sky. They didn't know that a vow had been made above them, one that would soon bring both good and bad things into their lives. The Watchers would not only come down, but they would also share things that were never meant to be shared. Azazel was the one who led them and guided them with a steady hand. This was the start of a fall like no other. Not just one person falling, but many, all bound by an oath, stepping into a fate that would break heaven's order. The world didn't know what was coming, but the mountain had heard it, the stars had seen it, and eternity itself had marked the night. The Watchers were no longer just watching. They had made a choice, and that choice would change everything. Heaven did not whisper Azazel's name like it did with so many other angels. He had something special about him that made people look at him and pay attention without even trying. He had a brilliance inside him, but it was different from the soft glow of the others. Some people were quiet and happy to go with the flow of the heavens. Azazel, on the other hand, burned like a flame, always reaching beyond where he was. His angelic nature and strong will made him one of the most memorable of the Watchers. Azazel was not the tallest or strongest of the 200, but he was the one whose voice stayed in people's minds the longest after they heard it. His words didn't just talk about wanting something. They were full of conviction, as if what he imagined could already come true. Even in the heavenly courts, this kind of determination was unusual. A lot of angels worked hard, but not many had the courage to follow their own path. Azazel did. That was the first sign of his presence in the story as it unfolded. He didn't take leadership. It was something that seemed to come from him. People who hadn't planned to listen ended up doing so anyway. His voice was steady, his thoughts were clear, and he was sure of himself. When he was with his friends, any doubt around him seemed to go away. There was no need for force or orders. His confidence was enough to get other people to follow him. It was as if he had an invisible thread that connected their fears and turned them into bravery. The Watchers were powerful beings, each one strong in its own way, but Azazel was different from the others in the group. Some were beautiful and made you feel good, and others had voices that calmed you down. But Azazel had a power that moved you. He could turn fear into determination, which is a rare skill. When the oath on Mount Hermon made people nervous, it was Azazel's voice that calmed them down. His faith protected theirs like a shield, and at that moment the angels were stronger and more confident. This power to change things didn't come from manipulation, but from being clear. He knew what he wanted, and that was enough to help others who weren't sure what they wanted. In a world where a moment of doubt could tear many apart, Azazel was the one thing that kept them all together. He didn't lead with chains. He led with fire, which sparked a will in his followers that they didn't know they had. Even among heavenly beings, this kind of gift was hard to find. His vision, not just his leadership, set him apart from everyone else. Some people saw the beauty of people and wanted it for a short time, but Azazel looked deeper. He saw the possibility of bringing what was hidden in heaven to earth. For him, the daughters of men were more than just pretty. They were the key to making something completely new, a mix of worlds and a change in fate. While others saw lines that couldn't be crossed, he saw chances to be taken. Even other angels couldn't deny that this made him different. They were drawn to him because he was sure of himself, but they also felt that he was different, more daring and willing to go further than they could have imagined. His bravery spread, but it also set him apart from the rest of the group. The Watchers all made the same promise, but within that promise, Azazel's flame stood out and burned brighter than the rest. People first noticed him because of the way he spoke and the way he acted. He didn't hesitate or look back as if he was afraid of what might happen next. When some people silently wondered if they should really cross the line between heaven and earth, Azazel acted like the decision had already been made a long time ago. This strong spirit is what made his friends remember him. When leaders are really sure of themselves, there is a calmness around them, and Azazel was the personification of this calmness. He wasn't frantic or loud. Every word and gesture was carefully chosen. Even though the other angels were great in their own right, they were drawn to his certainty. It made them feel better, even though it took them down paths that were never meant to be walked. His strength gave them strength, and his clarity gave them vision. The most important thing that set him apart was the way he balanced light and dark within himself. He was bright, but his brightness was different from the others. It had a sharper edge, like a sword shining in the sun instead of the soft glow of dawn. This sharpness made them want to be with him because it promised action, change, and something more than the never-ending cycle of watching and waiting. The Watchers were called that because they were supposed to watch, but Azazel's spirit wouldn't stay still. He wouldn't just watch. He would do something. And in that choice, he brought others into Tia. His circle of his will. Azazel was more than a friend to the other 200 people. He was the voice that gave them strength, and the person who stayed strong when doubt crept into their minds. They could feel his fire, and it burned away their own fears. Each angel was strong on their own, but with Azazel by their side, they felt like they could do anything. His presence was not just a part of the vow. It was what made it so strong, even when doubt should have torn it apart. And so, even before the Watchers fully entered the world of men, Azazel's mark had already been made. He was different, and there was no doubt about it. He kept going when others stopped. He saw destiny where others saw danger. And in that restless fire, he became the person who would not only enter the story, but also shape it with his own hands. Each angel had wisdom that had been given to them from the beginning, knowledge that kept the heavens in harmony. They knew how the stars moved, how the seasons changed, and how creation worked behind the scenes. But in this sea of knowledge, there were limits set by the Eternal One that could never be crossed. Some truths were meant to stay hidden because they were too heavy for weak human hands to hold. But Azazel was drawn to these hidden things, as if the veil itself was a challenge to him, a door that needed to be opened. The knowledge that stirred inside him wasn't the usual skill of the heavens. It was something sharper and more dangerous. He had closely watched the creation of the world and saw that it contained secrets about how to make things, weapons, jewelry, and powers that could change the course of human life. Other angels watched these things in silence, happy to keep them to themselves. Azazel's spirit, on the other hand, burned with the desire to share. He wanted to give people things that were against the rules, things that would change their lives forever. Yet, the Watchers had an unspoken rule that there were limits to what they could teach. It was okay to teach people how to survive, how to understand the seasons, and how to see the movements of the skies. This kind of knowledge fit with their job as Watchers, who were protectors who made sure that people could grow and thrive. But beyond these limits were the guarded secrets, the kind of knowledge that could turn innocence into corruption and peace into unrest. It wasn't that the knowledge itself was bad. It was that people weren't ready for its weight and would bend under it. Azazel could feel this line, but he pushed against it in his mind. He thought that what was kept back could be given, and that people deserved more than what they got. For him, the things he wasn't allowed to do shone brighter than the things he could do. He carried the seeds of war weapons, making ornaments, using metals, and painting the face in his mind. He knew them as someone who had seen the divine mysteries, and the idea of giving them away became both a temptation and a mission. Others around him whispered warnings. They knew that there were things that people shouldn't know, at least not yet. People were weak. Their hearts could be easily swayed, and their wants could quickly grow too big for them to handle. Giving them tools of power was a risk that would destroy their innocence. But Azazel's voice was louder than their whispers. He thought that knowledge was a gift, and that gifts should be shared. Wasn't it better to give people power than to take it away? Wasn't it better to teach than to hold back? But in the quiet of his mind, there was another pull, one that wasn't as noble. Azazel didn't just want to bless people. He wanted to change them and leave his mark on them in ways that couldn't be erased. Because he taught them things that no other angel would dare to, they would always remember him as the one who changed their world. The appeal of such power and fame was too strong to resist. The knowledge he wasn't supposed to have looked like it had a dangerous beauty. He was fascinated by the art of making swords and knives, as well as the art of forging metal into tools for war and survival. He saw men who had once been farmers and herders turn into warriors with swords in their hands. He saw women with makeup on, their beauty painted and sharpened in ways that nature hadn't given them, and their charms made bigger to win hearts. Every secret had the power to change things, to change the course of human history forever. And Azazel could reach all of it. There was a time when he was on the edge of silence and could have kept these secrets to himself forever. But that time went by quickly, burned up by his desire. He couldn't stop thinking about what he knew. He started to think of himself as a liberator, the one who would break the silence and give people the knowledge they had been denied. He called freedom what other people called forbidden. He couldn't stop thinking about limits. And with each passing moment, he fought them harder. Why should wisdom not be shared? Why should the truth be kept in a cage? The Eternal had given them sight, and in that sight they had seen amazing things. Wasn't it natural to pass them on? He dressed up his desire in reasons that sounded good, but underneath them was his burning desire to be different, to be the one whose name echoed in the world below. The other angels could feel his pull because Azazel spoke in a way that was hard to resist. He talked about how iron shaped by hand could be strong, how precious metals could be turned into ornaments, and how painted colors could make faces look beautiful. He told them that people could reach greater heights and achieve greatness if they were given the right tools. His voice was convincing, and that can make people less resistant. Slowly, one by one, hearts that had been strong began to break. There were still whispers of worry, though. Some people said that this was not teaching but messing with things, not guiding but ruining them. They remembered why they had been sent, to watch, to guard, and not to change the course of human history. But Azazel's fire burned hotter than their doubts, and his passion filled the room with no room for doubt. Even caution became quiet in the face of such certainty. What he knew wasn't light. It was heavy, almost intoxicating. To carry it was to carry sin itself. Azazel didn't want to carry it by himself anymore. He wanted to share it with the world and see the look of recognition in people's eyes as they held something they had never seen before. It was in that vision that his uniqueness grew darker. He didn't want to stay the same. He had to change, teach, and show. In his mind, the lines between what was okay and what wasn't started to blur. What used to be clear became dark, and he walked through those dark places with confidence, sure that he was not breaking the law, but fulfilling his destiny. Azazel kept the secrets that no one else would share in the quiet space between heaven's silence and people's innocence. And so, the story of knowledge took its first dangerous turn. He hadn't said it out loud yet, but it was in his heart, waiting for the moment when silence would break and the truth would come out. The first time Azazel reached down to humans was something the earth had never seen before. Men and women lived simple lives with the sun and the seasons setting the pace for their days. Their tools were rough and made of stone and wood. They were good enough to plow the ground or collect what the fields and trees had to offer. Violence was easy, like hitting someone with your fists or throwing rocks at them in anger. The world was rough, but it was peaceful. Azazel walked into this quiet, a place with the fire of knowledge in his hands. He wasn't a stranger, because the people had already started to feel the presence of beings bigger than them. The Watchers had come close, and their beauty was striking. Their voices had a weight that no human voice could carry. Azazel stood out from the rest because of his power and the mystery he carried. When he looked into the eyes of people, it was as if he was showing them something they couldn't have, a promise of greatness that was just out of reach. The first contact was soft, with words spoken in a whisper and lessons given not as commands but as invitations. He showed them metals that shone through the ground, veins of iron and copper that were stuck in stone and needed to be freed. Men had only seen these as odd-colored rocks before, which were interesting but not useful. Azazel bent down and ran his hand over the hidden patterns, showing how fire and hammer could bend the metal into shapes that wood and stone could never take. Men saw blades being made for the first time. They saw how dull stone was replaced by iron that was sharpened to a shine, a line of silver that could cut through wood with one stroke. The sound of the hammer hitting metal echoed through the valleys, and it made people feel both awe and fear. What had been easy work before now seemed like it had changed into something strong and scary. They followed Azazel's voice step by step. He showed them how to build furnaces, how to shape fire to soften the hard metal, and how to cool it down in water so that it hardened with strength beyond what they could have imagined. His hands were steady, and his instructions were clear. In the light of the forge, men felt like they were touching the secrets of heaven. They couldn't believe how much power they had in their own hands. But knowing how to forge also brought something bad. The first swords shone in the sun, and there was no denying how beautiful they were. Men held them with shaky hands, amazed by how heavy they were, how sharp they were, and how easily the blade cut through things. But behind their amazement was another thought: how easily this weapon could pierce flesh and end a life. As steel took shape, innocence shivered at the thought of violence. Azazel did not keep this a secret. He taught them how to make tools for the field and weapons for the hand of war. He showed them all: spears with iron tips, shields with metal bindings, and daggers hidden in belts. The men thought these were amazing gifts of strength. They didn't feel small in front of wild animals or enemies from other tribes anymore. They felt like they could do anything with iron in their hands. And behind their growing bravery was Azazel, the teacher who taught them how to turn their weaknesses into strengths. The first people to use these weapons didn't fight in wars like we do now. They fought in small fights between groups that lived near each other. But there was no doubt that things had changed. In the past, fights ended with bruises and broken bones. Now, blood flowed deeper and death came faster. People who hadn't learned were scared because they saw their enemies holding a power they didn't understand. The peace of the early days started to shake, broken by the sharp edge of iron. Azazel watched it happen and felt a sense of satisfaction inside. He had given people the gift of strength, and they used it gladly. They showed their thanks by bowing to him and calling him Master, Giver of Strength. To them, he was more than just a teacher. He was the one who brought them their destiny and lifted them above the limits of their ancestors. In their hearts, fear and awe mixed because they knew that what they had received was both a blessing and a burden. Not just men were interested in him. Women also listened as he talked about arts they didn't know about. But making weapons was the most important thing to do back then. Azazel changed the very fabric of human life because of this knowledge. Tribes didn't just count their warriors anymore. They also looked at how sharp their blades were and how strong their armor was. War, which used to be clumsy and short, was now strong and clear. The sound of metal hitting metal became common in the valleys. This was a rhythm that had never been heard before Azazel came. The sparks that flew from the forges looked like stars that had fallen to the ground. Each one was a reminder of the angel's forbidden gift. Kids saw their dads make weapons, and they learned that strength was no longer just in their hands, but also in the steel they carried. But under the awe and pride, there was a shadow. The weapons not only kept people safe, but they also caused problems. Brothers fought, neighbors didn't trust each other, and the earth drank more blood than ever. Every win made people want more power, and every loss made people angry and want revenge. The sword, which was once a wonder, became a chain that kept people in cycles of war. Azazel knew what he had done, but he kept going. His teaching spread quickly, going from tribe to tribe and village to village. The forges lit up wherever he walked, and the sound of hammers followed him like a trail. Once men had tasted the sharpness of iron, they could never go back to the simplicity of stone. Things had changed in the world, and innocence was fading away, replaced by ambition, fear, and the shine of steel. Every lesson brought Azazel and humans closer together. People saw him as more than just a teacher. They saw him as someone who could walk between heaven and earth, a figure too big to ignore. Their respect was strong, and so was their need. And once people get a taste of power, they want more, and only Azazel seemed to be able to satisfy that need. And so the first link between angel and man was made not in silence or worship, but in fire and steel. What started out as curiosity turned into devotion, and what started out as teaching turned into a legacy of war. Men's hands, which had only been used to plant and harvest, now held blades that sparkled in the sun. These blades held both hope and destruction. In the quiet unfolding of ancient times, when the world was still innocent and people didn't know about hidden arts, Azazel moved closer to those who lived simply. His shadow reached farther than the mountains where he and his brothers swore their oath of death. Azazel's path was different from the other watchers in that it led him to teach, not in purity, but in secrets that were hidden behind a beautiful shimmer. He knew that power could show itself in more than just war and weapons made of iron. It could also show itself in beauty. This beauty, so delicate and enchanting, could disarm hearts and bend wills more completely than any sword ever could. People say that Azazel was the first to tell women how to change. Until then, the sun, wind, and other gentle forces of nature were the only things that touched faces. But Azazel brought in powders and colors that were a mystery to make the eyes brighter, the shadows deeper, and the skin glow softer. What used to be normal became more so. The face, which used to be a sign of innocence, became a mask made with a secret purpose. And as women started to use these secrets, the men of the world were spellbound by a kind of beauty they had never seen before. He didn't stop there. He showed how to decorate with gold and silver, metals that weren't shaped into weapons or plowshares this time, but into shiny trinkets that sparkled in the light. Necklaces that hung like thin chains on the skin, rings that went around fingers, and earrings that hung like drops of stars. Azazel knew that jewelry was more than just decoration. It was a sign, a way to get people to look, to make them want something, and to make them jealous. What started out as a simple decoration turned into a sign of power, a way to compete, and a way to get people's attention. He added rich fabrics and colors that no one had ever seen before. He showed how to weave patterns and dye threads in shades of gold, indigo, and crimson. Through this, the daughters of men were dressed not only in clothes to keep them warm, but also in clothes that would make them look beautiful. Seduction was no longer just about being there. It was also about design, carefully planned, sharpened like an arrow to hit the hearts of those who looked too long. Azazel was smarter than his friends because he knew something that they didn't. He knew that wars aren't just fought with weapons. They're also fought in secret wants, unspoken jealousy, and longing that makes sense. He taught women these skills, which would lead to jealousy, competition, and unrest among people on Earth. Her husband admired her, and her neighbor envied her when she wore jewelry. Men looked at a young woman who painted her eyes with desire. From this came arguments, fights, and the slow end of peace. Beauty stopped being a simple gift of life and became a weapon used in secret. Men started to look for the most beautiful women, and women started to compete with each other to be more beautiful and powerful in the eyes of their suitors. These teachings upset whole families because men who used to work quietly and happily became restless as they compared, desired, and longed for what they saw. The daughters of men also felt this restlessness as they competed with and measured themselves against the brilliance of their peers. What used to be harmony turned into competition, which led to lies, anger, and the need to be in charge. The ornaments themselves were more than just decorations. They became signs of power. People who couldn't get them started to want them. People who wore them used them to get people's attention. As people wanted these things more and more, the purity of creation faded. A simple necklace could tear families apart, and a painted face could destroy trust between family members. Azazel's gift seemed small, even lovely, but it held the seed of greater destruction. The forbidden knowledge spread quickly because secrets that are interesting are hard to keep. Women gave it to their daughters, who then gave it to their daughters. Soon, the earth was full of colors on people's faces, metals that shone in the sun, and clothes that sparkled in the market. As this beauty spread, men's hearts became more and more restless. They fought not just for land or food, but also for the attention of women, who were more attractive because of Azazel's teachings. The seed of seduction had grown into a weapon sharper than iron, and it was used without mercy. Azazel was watching all of this from behind. He had done what he set out to do. He had broken the bonds of humanity by turning beauty into competition. Families split up, brothers fought, and friendships ended. Jealousy spread like a fire from one house to another. Men's simple lives, which used to be free of hidden desires, became full of longing and lust. The sunlight made the ornaments shine, but there was a shadow of disagreement behind their shine. The Watchers had all taught forbidden arts, but Azazel's knowledge was different because it hurt not only the body, but also the heart and spirit. Weapons could kill, but beauty could make people slaves. Armor could protect, but seduction could ruin. His teaching was more dangerous than any other because it went to the hidden parts of the soul. It made love a competition, marriage a fight, and community a source of jealousy. And so the world of early man was no longer quiet. It shone and sparkled with painted faces and decorated bodies, but there was trouble brewing beneath the surface. A fallen angel had touched the harmony of creation, which had been perfect until then. This angel knew that sometimes the most powerful destruction comes not with a roar, but with a whisper. In the beginning, when the line between heaven and earth still seemed thin, Azazel and his friends had already started to spread their forbidden teachings to people all over the world. But one of the most disturbing things I learned was the secret of how to cast spells and enchantments. This was no longer about making weapons out of metal or putting jewelry on bodies. This was about power that bent the unseen, power that whispered in the dark, and power that made men and women think they could control their own fate. At first, people learned about magic in a quiet way. It started with little things, like symbols carved into the ground, chants whispered under people's breath, and herbs gathered at a certain time of the moon. These weren't innocent experiments with nature. They were instructions from people who used to know the secrets of creation from a pure place, but now share them in a distorted way. The Watchers, especially Azazel, took what was meant to be respected and used it to control people. The art of root cuttings was one of the first forms of this. Azazel told them that plants with Hidi and powers grew under the ground. These plants could do more than just heal or feed people. They could also cast spells, Roots could be used in potions, burned into smoke, or ground into powders that seemed to change how a person thought, felt, or dreamed. People used the things that the Most High made for food and healing to do magic. People started to think that these mixtures could change other people's minds, making love where there was none, hate where there was none, or binding someone else's will. This new information spread like wildfire in dry grass. Groups of people became very interested in the unseen forces that could be controlled through spells. People no longer wanted to live in trust of divine order. They wanted to control their own fate. The roots that were pulled from the ground were no longer just roots. They became charms, amulets, and talismans. People thought they were gateways to power when they hung around their necks, buried them under doorways, or burned them in fires. With each cut of a root and each whispered chant, people's connection to heaven faded, leaving behind a false sense of control. Azazel was aware of how dangerous this information was. He knew how easy it was to get people to do things by promising them power over someone else. He saw how quickly fear could turn into dependence, and how quickly trust in God could fade when people thought they could control unseen forces. He didn't just teach people about magic, he also planted desire, obsession, and corruption in their souls with each lesson. It didn't take long for magic to become part of culture. Small charms turned into rituals over time. People came together to chant in unison, and the smoke from burning herbs filled the air. People who used to pray simply now thought they could use spells to get answers, ask for blessings, or curse their enemies. Kids watched their moms make potions in clay pots, their dads carve signs into stones, and their older relatives teach them which stars went with which spells. The pure order of creation was fading, and a dark mirror that twisted the gifts of heaven took its place. The roots of the earth, which used to heal, started to hurt. Not only were potions made to make people sick, but also to kill them. They ground herbs into powders and secretly put them in food and drinks. People were afraid of each other because they thought their neighbors were up to no good and their relatives didn't trust them. A smile could hide a curse, and a gift from a friend could hide a spell. Men's hearts were tightly bound by the unseen chains of suspicion which kept them apart. Some of them looked up at the stars during their meetings, thinking they could change the heavens themselves. Azazel had also put this thought in his mind because he had seen how the heavens worked when he was pure. He twisted that knowledge to say that if people could map the stars and follow their paths, they could control their own fate. As a result, astrology and magic mixed, and the skies were no longer a sign of God's greatness, but a tool for those who wanted to be in charge. These teachings had a terrible effect. People who used to believe in God's provision now believed in charms. Before making decisions, leaders looked to sorcerers for advice. Families hired spellbearers to keep their homes safe or to hurt their enemies. This new need for magic spread through every part of society. Fear ruled people's hearts because they didn't know where the next curse would come from or who might be whispering spells against them in the dark of night. The earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of this corruption as the roots were cut and the herbs were gathered. Hands looking for power were now taking away the soil that had once given food and healing. People no longer harvested plants with gratitude. Instead, they pulled them out of the ground in the hopes that they would serve human desire instead of divine design. And with every root pulled, the connection between people and creation grew weaker because the earth had been turned into a tool for magic. The Watchers saw how much people loved these things, and Azazel felt his power growing. What could be more satisfying than seeing people lose faith in their creator and instead believe in powders, potions, and charms? He knew that every whispered spell took men farther away from the light of heaven. Every spell they cast made their souls more bound, not to freedom, but to more bondage. So, the knowledge of magic spread from tribe to tribe and land to land, becoming part of stories, traditions, and ceremonies. Chants ruined festivals that used to be sacred. Fires that used to keep people warm turned into places to cast spells. The laughter of kids bounced off walls that had signs of protection on them, drawn there out of fear of curses that couldn't be seen. This knowledge shaped whole generations, and magic became something that was not strange, but normal, even common. There was an illusion of power in the world, but underneath that shimmer was decay. What started with cutting roots and whispering words had grown into a culture full of magic. Azazel, the teacher of forbidden arts, stood behind it all, happy with the chaos he had caused. After the Watchers came down, the world started to shimmer with strange new colors. Azazel's whispers of forbidden knowledge had already changed the way men and women lived, dressed, fought, and even thought about things they couldn't see. But the biggest shadow was still to come, and it didn't come in whispers or painted decorations. It came in flesh and blood. When the Watchers looked at the daughters of men and chose them as friends, they changed the way that God made things. The Nephilim, or giants, were born from these unnatural unions. They were huge beings whose very existence showed that corruption ran deeper than words or charms could ever reach. People were amazed by them at first. The Nephilim were so tall that they looked like mountains walking on the ground. Their voices were deep, like thunder, and their steps shook the ground. They had the beauty of their angelic fathers and the shape of their human mothers, which was a mix of heaven and earth. But what seemed amazing soon turned out to be a curse, because these beings were not made in God's plan, but against it. They were not born in peace, but in defiance, and with them came a wave of violence and hunger that the world had never seen before. The Nephilim grew quickly and were much stronger than humans. Their hunger stripped bare fields that used to grow enough food for families. Grain stores disappeared in days, livestock numbers dropped, and forests that had been around for hundreds of years fell into their hands as they tried to satisfy their never-ending hunger. The land couldn't keep up with how much they were eating, and soon they wanted darker things. They started eating not just animals, but also people. Cannibalism spread among them, and the earth groaned under the weight of all the evil. This new generation didn't just eat, they ruled. Because of their height and strength, they were natural, rulers over humans, and soon mortals had to serve them. The giants' will crushed communities that used to thrive in simplicity. Men worked hard to feed them, women were taken against their will, and children were scared of shadows that were too big to escape. When the Nephilim walked, the songs of joy stopped and the cries of the oppressed took their place. Not only in spirit, but also in the very fabric of life, the harmony of creation was broken. Azazel's power was very strong in them. They got knowledge from their fathers that mortals were never meant to have, but it was twisted and made stronger in their bad blood. They learned how to fight with weapons that were bigger and stronger than any that men had ever used at an alarming rate. Their cities had walls so high that they seemed to touch the sky. They weren't built to honor God. They were built in prideful defiance. They taught people to be afraid of power instead of life. The whispers of Azazel became violent and oppressive storms through them. The earth, which was once peaceful, turned into a battlefield. Tribes fought each other because the giants who wanted loyalty led or forced them to. Nephilim fought each other in wars that tore apart whole areas. Their incredible strength destroyed villages, and their rivalries caused rivers of blood to flow. They brought weapons made from Azazel's teachings. The swords shone like fire, the spears were sharp like fangs, and the shields were covered in scary symbols of power. Battles that used to be fought with wooden clubs and stones now shook the ground with steel and fire. But it wasn't just their bodies that spread corruption. Their power did too. People started to worship them, tell stories about how powerful they were, and see them as gods. Because of their huge size, many people bowed down to them and worshipped them, leaving the Creator who gave them life and turning to the children of rebellion instead. People built shrines in their honor, made sacrifices at their feet, and sang songs about their victories. The Nephilim, who were born out of defiance, became idols to the people they had oppressed. They were a twisted reflection of glory that should have been in heaven. The more people there were, the more chaos there was. Their wars and feasts left rivers running red with blood. There were no trees left where they had been. The sound of their battles echoed through the mountains. The earth itself seemed to cry out, unable to handle the growing corruption on its surface. The air was heavy with smoke from their fires and cries from their victims, which made everyone feel uneasy. The Watchers looked at their children and didn't stop them because they were proud. They were amazed at how strong their kids were, seeing in them a reflection of their own rebellion. Azazel was the most proud of what had been let loose. He had taught men how to use weapons and seduce women, and he had seen his teachings come to life in the giants, who were the very embodiment of corruption. His power didn't need to be whispered in the dark anymore. It echoed across the world with every step they took. People on Earth had little hope because they were stuck between fear and interest. Many gave in and agreed to serve the Nephilim in exchange for their lives. Some people fought back, but most of the time, they were crushed by overwhelming force. These giants cast a shadow over entire generations, and they didn't know a world without them. Fear, violence, and bathos. Bloodshed took the place of innocence. People used to trust in God's plan, but now they only felt hopeless because of bad government. But in this darkness, the corruption went deeper than the body. Mixing heavenly beings with mortals crossed the lines of creation. It was a crime that spread across the world, leaving behind effects that would last for a long time. Azazel and the Watchers let loose things that changed bloodlines, cultures, and even humanity itself. The Nephilim were not just big people. They were big examples of how bad things can get when you do what you shouldn't. So the world groaned under them. In their presence, mountains looked smaller, rivers looked narrower, and forests looked thinner. A new order of strength, domination, and blood had taken the place of the harmony of creation. Azazel was at center of it all. His teachings had turned knowledge into sin and sin into flesh that walked the earth with an unending hunger. The earth used to be a balanced garden where rivers fed fields. Families got together in peace, and life moved slowly under the watchful eye of the Creator. But that peace was gone. As forbidden knowledge spread and the Nephilim were born, blood began to soak into the ground at a rate that the earth could no longer handle. Villages that used to be busy with trade and family now echoed with screams. Homes that used to be full of laughter were now burning because of oppression. The order of creation had turned into chaos, and corruption was easy to see. The Nephilim, huge and cruel, became machines of death. They used their great strength to hurt others. They ate people when they couldn't get enough food. When they weren't held back by their desire for power, they marched into villages, tore down walls, broke families, and took whatever they wanted. They hurt people not only physically, but also spiritually by taking away their hope. Fear was the only way to stay alive. Parents didn't tell their kids bedtime stories about peace anymore. Instead, they whispered warnings about the giants who could come at any time to take them away. Bloodshed spread like a disease. Men who were happy working their fields now sharpened blades under Azazel's guidance, turning against family and neighbors. The weapons of war that had been given to people became sharper, stronger, and more deadly. Iron and bronze fought in fields that used to grow grain. Where shepherds used to carry staffs, spears were raised. Instead of the smell of bread, there was the smell of smoke and burning flesh. People learned how to use weapons and started to want power like the giants. The giants weren't the only ones who were violent. Their corruption had spread to men as well. People started to act like their oppressors. Power turned into a god. Strength was the only thing that mattered. People made fun of mercy and thought kindness was stupid. In the past, men helped each other when things got tough. Now, they betray each other to stay alive, get rich, or get closer to the giants who ruled them. Communities fell apart. There was no more trust. There was no sacred oath or promise. The moral fabric of humanity began to come apart, thread by thread, until there was almost nothing left of the innocence that once defined them. They took wives by force. Kids grew up not knowing love, but fear. Brothers killed each other over food. Fathers left their families to look for safety that never came. The strong ate the weak, not just in body, but also in spirit. People used to sing songs of praise that went up to heaven, but now the cries of the oppressed and the chants of war are louder than those songs. Idols carved by shaking hands were raised high as offerings to the giants and the fallen ones, showing their devotion to corruption itself. The natural order started to break down as this wave of violence and evil grew. Greed's endless demands were too much for the land to handle. Weapons and fortifications took everything from the forests. The rivers were full of blood, and their waters were no longer clean. The animals, who had once been peaceful companions of people, ran deeper into the wild, or were killed by people who did it for fun, not because they needed to. The heavens seemed to darken as corruption spread, and they watched in silence as men and giants alike desecrated what had once been holy. The moral decline of people did not happen all at once, but over time. It all started with curiosity and the willingness to listen to secret teachings that were against the rules. Then came imitation, when men dressed like the Watchers, carried weapons, and practiced charms. At first, it seemed safe, even empowering, but it quickly took over their lives. People broke what had been set up as sacred boundaries, and once they broke them, the pieces spread out so far that they couldn't be put back together by people. People had twisted the knowledge that was meant to help them understand the Creator's glory into weapons of destruction. By accepting it, they lost the very essence of who they were meant to be. The giants, who were born out of rebellion, became symbols of the end of humanity. Men worshipped them as gods and gave them blood sacrifices at their feet. Azazel taught women how to wear jewelry, and they thought that being beautiful would keep them safe. Stories that praised strength and made fun of humility were used to raise children. The culture had changed. Pride, lust, and violence destroyed values that were once based on goodness. People didn't listen to the elders, who used to have wisdom. Their voices were drowned out by the noise of greed and ambition. Not just in rivers that ran red after battles, but also in the hearts of men whose desires were stained. People had forgotten the word mercy. People made fun of compassion. Justice was twisted, and the only thing that mattered was the weight of a sword. People who wanted to live in a good way were silenced or killed, their lives snuffed out like weak flames in a storm. A world made for peace had become a place of endless fighting, where the sound of crying never stopped. The cries of the earth got louder as the heavens looked down. It seemed like the soil didn't want the blood that was spilled on it, as if creation wanted to get rid of the stain. Men's corruption came from both outside and inside, twisting their souls so that they couldn't see what they had lost. They didn't look for the Creator anymore. They had forgotten what it was like to be innocent. Their hearts and minds had been changed so that they were like the Watchers who had led them astray, and Azazel, who was happy to see them fall. It felt like the world had hit rock bottom. The weight of sin was heavy on every mountain, valley, and heart. The giants roared, the men followed orders, and the women cried. All the while, the sound rose to heaven, not as a prayer, but as a cry of despair. Shadows swallowed light, lust took over love, and tyranny took the place of justice. But in the quiet of night, when the fires of the giants died down and the sound of war faded, a few still whispered prayers, weak and shaking, hoping that they could still be heard above the noise of corruption. The ground was covered in blood, but in the dark, there was a tiny light of hope that seemed too small to fight the storm that Azazel and his friends had started. The earth was no longer the peaceful place it used to be. Rivers that once carried their song to the sea gently now ran heavy with blood. Instead of the laughter of children, the fields that had been planted for harvest heard echoes of violence. People weren't the only ones crying out in those days. The ground itself was groaning under the weight of corruption. People said that the ground itself was tired of swallowing so much blood, as if it couldn't take being the place where cruelty ruled anymore. People had gone against the order of creation because they had learned things they shouldn't have and were stronger than giants. The innocent were hurt, the weak were oppressed, and even the air felt heavy with sadness. The voices of men, women, and children rose together like smoke after a fire, reaching up to the sky. They cried not only because they were in pain, but also because they felt helpless, as if there was no way out of the violence in their world. But it wasn't just people who broke the silence of heaven. The ground shook as if it were sad. Old texts say that the earth itself cried out in grief, as if creation could feel the wounds that were done to it. Every tree, mountain, and river had to bear the weight of bloodshed, and their silent testimony joined in with the cries of people. People who still wanted to be good and honest raised their hands to the sky and begged for help. Mothers who had lost their children, fathers whose strength had been broken by oppression, and elders whose wisdom had been silenced by arrogance all cried together. They prayed that the fallen angels' corruption would not lead to more injustice. They didn't want money or revenge, they just wanted the violence to stop. The broken prayed for healing and the chance to breathe again without being afraid of giants trampling their homes or soldiers using weapons that weren't meant to be used against them. The angels who had stayed true were not blind to this sadness. From their high perch in the sky, they watched the earth fall apart. The light that once showed peace was replaced by scenes of horror. Angels are said to be beings of order and balance, and what they saw made them very sad. They saw their own brothers, those who had died, teaching secrets that were never meant for people. They saw men making swords and spears with unholy accuracy. Women putting on spells that weren't meant to make them look good, but to make them look sexy. And sorcerers using the roots of the earth to make illusions that made fun of the Creator's light. The faithful angels couldn't stay quiet, so they raised their voices to the throne of the Almighty. They didn't cry out for themselves, they cried out for the earth and the children of men. "O Lord of heaven," they cried, "you see what has been done on earth. You can see how Azazel taught men how to make weapons, how others taught women how to make charms and jewelry, and how sorcery is now spreading among people like a river of poison. You can see the giants growing and eating things that aren't theirs. How long will the earth have to put up with this violence? How long will the actions of the fallen leave marks on your creation?" Their voices were full of sadness and need. They begged for help, for judgment, and for things to be brought back into balance. The angels' cries and the earth's cries came together and rose up before the throne of the Most High. This part of the story is very important because it shows that not only people prayed, but also creation and heaven together sought freedom. It was like everyone, except the ones who had fallen, cried out for justice. The Almighty, who sees everything, heard these cries. He who had made the world out of chaos and given people life was not deaf to their cries. He had heard the cries, "Bienam Dios on tesoas," E4. He had seen every act of violence, every tear, and every drop of blood shed for no good reason. But in God's perfect timing, there was a time when all the voices came together, the voices of men, the earth, and the faithful angels. Judgment started to stir in that convergence. But the faithful angels kept asking for what they wanted. They brought all of their sadness to the throne. They talked about how men had been tricked by knowledge that wasn't meant for them, how women had been trapped by fake beauty, and how the giants, who were born from unnatural unions, had filled the earth with violence. They showed the Creator not only the sins of the fallen, but also the pain of the innocent. They didn't ask for revenge. They asked for the world to be restored so that it could breathe in peace again. The picture of this moment is both haunting and very moving. Picture a courtroom where the witnesses are not just people, but also the ground they are standing on. The prosecutors are the faithful hosts of heaven. The accused are the fallen angels, the giants, and the corrupt generations that thrived on chaos. The judge is at the center of it all. He is the one whose eyes can see through every mask and every secret. He hears the cries of both heaven and earth, and nothing is kept from him. In this serious exchange, we find the meaning of the cry of the earth. It wasn't just a sound, it was the groaning of creation and the lament of innocence crushed by evil. It was the admission of human powerlessness and the plea for heaven's loyalty. They made a petition that couldn't be ignored together. And even though the answer from the Almighty had not yet been fully revealed, the stage was being set. The heavens leaned in, the earth shook in anticipation, and the angels waited quietly after their prayer, knowing that the judge of all would not let injustice rule forever. The silence that followed was thick, but it felt like there was something certain about it, like the calm before the storm. Once the cry reached the throne, it was clear that a reckoning was coming. The earth had spoken, the angels had spoken, and the Lord had heard. Creation held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The archangels could no longer stay quiet when the cries of the earth and the cries of the innocent rose to the heavens. These angels were not like the others. They were the most powerful ones, the ones who were closest to God's throne, who carried out his orders, and who saw the story of creation unfold. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel all prayed together, and their prayer was heard in both heaven and earth. They didn't pray for help because they were impatient. They did it because they were in pain. They had seen how far corruption had spread and how Azazel and his friends had turned what was pure into tools of destruction. Michael, the great warrior and guardian, was the first to say something. His heart burned with a desire for justice, and he had watched with sadness as the giants destroyed the land, crushing both the strong and the weak. Michael yelled, "O Lord of all creation, you are the king whose throne will last forever. Take a look at what Azazel has done. He has told us how to make steel and sharpened blades that cut through flesh. He has made war a way of life, and blood flows like water now. How long will your creation be able to handle this violence? You are fair, and you won't let corruption last forever. We ask you, Lord, to act because the earth shakes because of his sins." Then Gabriel, the angel who brings God's secrets, spoke up. He had seen how words that were meant to tell the truth had been turned into spells and charms. "O Most High, you who gave man speech and wisdom to understand, see how those gifts have been used in the wrong way," Gabriel begged. Instead of prayer, people now use spells instead of truth, and lies have wrapped themselves around people's hearts like chains. Azazel and his friends have led your creation off the path. They have changed hearts from light to dark. We ask you to send your order, because your word is life, and no shadow can resist it. Raphael, whose name means God heals, was very sad about the sickness that had spread across the earth. He was responsible for taking care of the well-being of all living things, but he saw how poison had taken over men and women, poison in the earth, poison in the spirit, and poison in the soul. He bent down and prayed, "O Lord of mercy, you made man out of dust and gave him life by breathing into him. But now, corruption is choking that breath. Azazel has taught men how to mix metals and make weapons, and now their hands destroy instead of building. The women have been led astray by charms and ornaments that make them less pure. People drink bitterness instead of healing because sorcery has been planted in the roots of the earth. Lord, let your hand clean us. Let your judgment take away the source of this corruption, for only then can healing come back." Then Uriel, the angel of light and fire, came forward. His voice was like a flame cutting through the dark. He had seen how the knowledge of the fallen had sparked rebellion and how shadows had spread across the globe. Uriel's prayer was urgent and sharp. "O Eternal One, you are the light that no darkness can overcome." But look how Azazel has pulled men into the dark. They have looked up at fake lights, lights that trick them, and lights that lead to destruction. The giants that come from these unions eat flesh and spread fear as if they were the kings of the world. But you are the only king. We beg you to shine your judgment, stop Azazel's work, and bring your light back to the world. The four archangels' voices rose together like a storm of prayer. It wasn't just one prayer. It was a chorus, with each voice carrying a different burden, but all asking for the same thing. They didn't say anything bad about people because corruption had tricked and enslaved them. Their words were directed at the source, Azazel and the fallen ones who had spread their forbidden teachings. They wanted justice not just for themselves, but also for the earth. The rivers that had turned red, the fields that had been trampled, and the people whose innocence had been taken away. The Almighty, who sits on the throne of eternity, paid attention. He was silent, not because he didn't care, but because he had to make a choice that would change the course of creation. He had heard the cries of men, he had heard the earth's cries. The faithful angels' prayers had reached him. The archangels, his strongest servants, had now made their case to him. The whole universe seemed to lean in to hear his answer, and everything in heaven went quiet. Then the Most High spoke, and his voice was so heavy that even the stars shook. He said, "Azazel, you will not have a place among my creation. You told secrets that you shouldn't have. You have ruined men with weapons of war, women with fake beauty, and the earth with magic. Your name will be a curse for all time. Tie him up by the hands and feet. Throw him into the dark, where there are sharp rocks and shadows. Put chains on him, and he will stay there until the day of judgment, when all corruption will be burned up." This order shook the heavens. There was no doubt, no second thoughts. There was no going back on the judgment. Azazel, who had once walked in the glory of heaven and known the light of the Most High, was now doomed to the deepest darkness. He would no longer walk among people, whisper his poison, or share his knowledge of how to destroy things. His fate was sealed, and his name would always be associated with shame. The archangels bowed down before God's judgment because his word was perfect and his justice was unbreakable. They didn't act like they were happy, because judgment is never easy. Instead, they bowed in deep respect, knowing that the Creator's will had been made clear. They had prayed for freedom, and freedom had been granted. Even though Azazel's chains were sure to happen, the world still bore the scars of his evil. The weapons he had taught men how to make were still in their hands. The gifts of jewelry and magic that women received had already become part of culture. The giants were still out and about, and they were still hungry. It would take more than one moment to clean up the earth, because once corruption is planted, it must be burned and flooded. The judgment of Azazel was the beginning, the first step toward restoration, but the full restoration would still need the Almighty's hand to move. And so, the archangels got up from their prayers with determination. Michael, ready for battle, was ready to follow the order to bind. Gabriel got ready to deliver the message of judgment. Raphael turned his face toward the healing that was to come. Uriel stood like a burning flame, protecting the light of the Most High. Everyone had prayed, and now everyone would do their part in action. The earth was still shaking, but now there was a whisper of hope in the shaking. People had not ignored the call of creation. The archangel's prayer had been heard. The order had been given. Azazel's fate was sealed. The darkness would still fight to stay strong, but light had already started to break through. It was Raphael who was chosen to carry out the order. His job was often to restore and heal among the archangels, but here he was given a job that had the weight of judgment. The Most High made it clear that Azazel should be caught, tied up, and thrown into the wilderness of Dudael, a barren place where people are sent to chains and exile. The choice was both final and sad. Raphael was not just a captor, he was also the hand of divine justice, making sure that corruption would no longer flow freely into the earth's veins. Raphael's presence was calm, but there was a strong will behind that calmness. He had seen what Azazel had done. He had seen rivers turn red with blood, children stop crying under the feet of giants. and women wear charms that made men sin even more. He had heard the whispers of magic in the wind, and he knew that Azazel had been at the center of it all. Raphael's job was to heal, but he knew that sometimes healing meant cutting away what was sick and sealing it off so that the rot couldn't spread. This wasn't cruel. It was mercy that looked like judgment. Dudale's wilderness was unlike any other place on Earth. It wasn't a place that was easy to find on maps or talk about. It was a place of exile, a harsh desert where jagged cliffs rose from the sand like broken teeth, and the ground itself seemed cursed with being empty. Nothing grew there, no water flowed, no birds sang, and there was no shade to cool off in. It was a quiet place with fire and wind that polished the rocks until they shone like iron. It may have looked like a barren wasteland to humans, but to the angels, it was a prison made by the Creator to keep those who had betrayed their duties. The earth shook beneath Raphael's feet as he came down with the power of the Most High. The other angels stood by in silence, knowing that this moment would mark the end of an age. Azazel, who had on Sea-beam bright, now stood in defiance, his body still showing signs of the glory he had given up. His eyes sparkled with fire, but it wasn't the light of heaven. It was the spark of rebellion, a flame that had chosen to burn against the wind instead of with it. Azazel did not bow even though he was told to. He sneered at Raphael, his voice full of anger. "You bind me," he hissed, "but you can't bind what I've already sown." The men now have the weapons I gave them. The decorations I gave to women are on their bodies. The magic words I whispered are now in their hearts. You can bury me in desert stone, but the fire will spread. My touch will last longer than I will. Raphael didn't get mad when he answered. His answer was calm, measured, and full of the authority of the one who sent him. You have spoken lies, and they have led to death. The seeds you have sown will grow into something, but only for a short time. The Most High's judgment is sure, and even if you brag about your legacy, it will not last. You will be quiet, and the world will be clean. Chains of light, made by God's own command, were brought forth. They weren't chains of iron or steel. They were bonds of light that were heavier than mountains, stronger than fire, and couldn't be broken by any rebellion. Raphael moved forward with these, and even though Azazel fought back, his strength was nothing compared to the will of the Almighty. The archangel's hands tied him up at the wrists and ankles, chest and neck, and each link of the chain kept him from the freedom he had once abused. The chain's brightness cut through the darkness that surrounded him, and his cries changed from pride to rage as he realized that his fate was unavoidable. Raphael picked him up from the ground and took him to Dudale after he was safe. The trip itself was full of images that would stay with those who heard about it. The wilderness yawned like an open wound, and the sands moved under skies that were quiet. The mountains rose like jagged stone thrones, with their peaks cutting into the sky. Deep valleys opened like mouths ready to swallow anything that was thrown into them. This was not an ordinary desert. It was chosen because it was so harsh and had an air of judgment about it. At the right place, a pit had been dug out of the ground and surrounded by sharp stones and burning sand. Its depths went far beyond what could be seen, and it was a chasm where light itself seemed to be afraid to stay. Azazel was going to be thrown here into a dark and quiet prison. The angels who were with Raphael stood around the pit in awe, their wings shimmering with the light from heaven. Raphael lowered Azazel into the dark, and as he did, his voice echoed through the stones as he said, "You are bound, Azazel, until the day of the great judgment. You will stay here, chained in misery, without a voice, unable to spread your poison. The earth will be cleaned, and the wrongs you did will not go unpunished." The pit swallowed Azazel, and the chains got tighter and tighter until his voice couldn't rise from the depths anymore. He was covered with a seal that no amount of rebellion could break. The desert stretched on forever around the pit. Its silence was even heavier now, as if the land itself knew that someone who had ruined creation was now trapped beneath it. Dudael's images were more than just geography. They became a symbol of exile, judgment, and how rebellion leads to emptiness. The cliffs were sharp and bare, and they showed Azazel's pride, which was once tall and bright, but is now broken and dead. The shifting and unyielding sand were like corruption, which eats up everything but leaves nothing behind. Its silence, heavy and eternal, was like the silence that fell on Azazel, who had once been loud in defiance but was now unable to speak. After Raphael finished the command, he didn't stay long. He had finished his work, but he did not feel triumphant. It was hard to make a decision, but it had to be done. He had tied up the source of great corruption, but the scars of that corruption would last forever in people, the earth, and the generations to come. There was still hope, though, because God's decree had gone out, and with it came the promise that no darkness, no matter how deep, could escape his justice. The angels who were with Raphael spread their wings, and the desert echoed with the sound of them leaving. Dudael stayed, with its pit sealed and its silence unbroken. Azazel writhed in chains of unbreakable light beneath its sands, like a fallen star thrown into endless night. And even though people would remember his name as a warning, he would no longer be there because the Most High had spoken, and no one could change what he said. The order had been given, and Raphael had already taken Azazel to the desert of Dudael, which was chosen as the place of exile. But the job wasn't done yet. The Most High's order was clear. Azazel was to be chained, buried, and locked away in darkness and fire until the last day, when all accounts would be settled. This wasn't just being locked up. It was being buried in a tomb that was both a prison and a furnace, where rebellion was crushed under the weight of divine justice. The chains that held Azazel were not normal ones. To him, they burned like fire, even though they shone like the light of heaven. The Creator's command was on each link, and no amount of strength, cunning, or hidden power could break them. The more he fought, the heavier they got, forcing him to stay still and quiet. His wings, which had once been spread out in pride, were now pressed against his sides, and his hands, which had once been stretched out to corrupt people, were now so tightly bound that they couldn't move. The light around him echoed every breath he took, reminding him that he was no longer free, and that his voice, which had once been full of arrogance, was now useless. Raphael didn't think twice. He dragged the chained Azazel to the pit that had been carved into the wilderness with steady determination. The cave was huge and deep, and the jagged stones that surrounded its mouth sparkled like blades in the sun. The air around it was thick with heat, as if the ground itself was on fire, but not from the earth. It was from judgment. As Azazel was lowered deeper into the chasm, the light from heaven lit it up for a brief moment, showing walls that were scarred with shadows and a void that looked like it had no bottom. Azazel would be thrown into this void, where a darkness that even the brightest light could not chase away would swallow him. Azazel thrashed around as the pit opened up in front of him. His voice got louder, sharper, and more bitter as it bounced off the rocks. He cursed the chains, cursed Raphael, and cursed the order that kept him there. "You can't get rid of me," he yelled. "The things I taught them will last. They will remember me even if I am buried because of the weapons, the magic, and the decorations. You can't stop me from rising again in their actions." But Raphael didn't say anything back. The chains were louder than any answer. Thais. I got tighter and glowed with a fierce light as they pulled him down. The other angels stood still and looked serious. They had seen rebellion, and now they witnessed its punishment. They knew that what was happening to Azazel was not just for him, but for everyone who had followed him. It was a sign that no corruption could stand against the Most High's order. The ground shook when Azazel fell into the pit. The stones groaned as if they could feel the weight of what was being sealed inside them, and dust rose into the air. The pit seemed to swallow his cries, and the deeper he sank, the quieter his voice became. Eventually it was gone, and silence took its place. Darkness surrounded him, pushing against him like a living thing, But this darkness wasn't empty. It was full of fire that didn't give off light, but instead ate it up. It was a fire that never stopped consuming. It wrapped around him, mixing with the chains of light. He was buried in both brilliance and flame, crushed between judgment and the results of his own rebellion. Time seemed to go on forever in that place. The winds of the desert were the only thing that broke the silence above. They swept over the jagged stones, leaving no sign of the prisoner below. But Azazel was still awake, fully aware, and fully tied up. He couldn't see anything because the chains of heaven blocked out everything but his own rebellion. He couldn't move anything because the weight of judgment held him down like stone. But he could feel everything. The fire that burned around him, the darkness that crushed him, and the silence that was louder than any other sound. This burial was a message, not just a punishment. It was a warning to the angels who saw it that glory used wrongly leads to chains. People didn't see it with their own eyes, but it was a reminder, whispered through their histories, that rebellion always ends, no matter how strong it seems. Azazel used to shine brightly among the watchers, his voice carrying weight and his hands shaping the future. He was now mute, buried under desert stone, and his hands were so tightly bound that he could never touch anything again. It seemed like his imprisonment had changed the desert of Dudel itself. The air above the pit got hotter, the stones got sharper, and the silence got thicker. It became a cursed place that both people and animals stayed away from. Even though no one could see the prisoner below, they all felt that the ground itself was dangerous. The winds that blew through its cliffs had a strange heaviness, as if they were carrying the muffled cries of the person buried below. And even though the sun shone brightly on its sands, the shadows there always seemed darker and more oppressive, as if they remembered what had been thrown down. Azazel was underneath it all, his mind a storm of rage. He thought of the giants, his huge children, who were still causing trouble all over the world. He thought about the weapons that men held, the jewelry that women wore, and the magic words that people still use today. He held on to the idea that his corruption had taken hold, and that even in chains, his power would live on after he was gone. But the fire and darkness pushed harder, and the chains reminded him every second that his time was up and his voice was silenced by law. Raphael stood over the sealed pit with his wings folded and his head down. He had finished his work, but the weight of it stayed with him. He had tied up the corruptor and buried him in fire and shadow, but he knew that the scars would last for generations. He still trusted what the Most High said, even though it wasn't just judgment that had been spoken, but also cleansing. Azazel's silence meant that healing could start, even if it was slow and painful. The angels who had seen the burial left, their wings stirring the air in the desert. The wilderness went back to being quiet, and the jagged cliffs around the sealed pit stood like guards. Azazel was chained up below them, buried alive in darkness and fire, and his pride was crushed by the order of heaven. He would never walk among men again. He would never whisper to women again. He wouldn't raise his hand to make weapons or magic. The earth was free of him, but his shadow was still there. And so the silence in Dudel grew deeper. It was a silence that told the story of the end of rebellion, a silence that felt like a fallen star crushing the ground. People and angels alike spoke Azazel's name, not as a passing story, but as a mark that carried the weight of blame, sin, and corruption. The statement, "all sin was ascribed to Azazel," is one of the most chilling in the traditions of Enoch and later works. It wasn't just a casual phrase. It was a deep, symbolic statement about how one being could hold the entire weight of human rebellion, disobedience, and the loss of purity on earth. Azazel was thrown down, chained, and locked up in darkness in the desert, but his shadow has been with people throughout history. To say that he was responsible for all sin meant that every lie, every act of rebellion, every act of violence, and every sign of corruption could be traced back to the knowledge he had given and the rebellion he had embodied. Azazel was not only punished for his own rebellion, he was also punished for what he spread among people. Azazel's gifts were the most dangerous of all the fallen watchers. They were weapons of war, ornaments of seduction, spells that turned innocent relationships into something bad, and teachings that praised violence and lust. Not only did he change the world, but he also turned it into a stage for blood and corruption. So, when the heavenly hosts said all sin was ascribed to Azazel, they were trying to find the one person who had taken divine wisdom and turned it into harmful tools that led to the moral collapse of humanity. The idea also had a deeper meaning that went beyond Azazel. It showed how sin, once it starts, doesn't stay small but spreads like fire, eating up everything it touches. Azazel became the personification of this idea. His name became known not only for what he had done, but also for the fact that corruption was everywhere. People could point to him as the source of all the problems in the world when they looked at their own situation. This doesn't mean that man wasn't to blame, because people still chose to follow his teachings, use his weapons, and go down the paths of destruction he had laid out. But Azazel was the one who opened the door, which made him the eternal symbol of guilt. This statement is also connected to a ritual. In later traditions, especially on the Day of Atonement, a scapegoat was chosen and sent into the wilderness, where it symbolically carried the people's sins. The name Azazel was sometimes used to refer to that scapegoat. The pictures were clear. All the sin, rebellion, and impurity of humanity were put on one person, who was then sent to the wilderness, cut off from the community, and left to die under God's curse. The wilderness where Azazel was bound was like this idea. It was a place of emptiness, away from life, and holiness, where the weight of sin was kept safe. The phrase "all sin was ascribed to Azazel" transformed into a theological assertion, integrating ritual, cosmic judgment, and symbolic significance. Azazel's part in this story shows how corruption always looks for a host, a figurehead, or a symbol on which to focus the effects. People could see themselves in Azazel's shadow when they looked at their own decay. He was a reminder of what happens when divine knowledge is misused, when creation is warped, and when holiness is forsaken. This symbolism went even further. Azazel was not only blamed for what he had done in the past, but he also became a lasting symbol of sin. His binding in darkness served as a cosmic drama that showed that sin has a source, a weight, and must be judged and stopped in the end. The phrase also makes people feel like they are all responsible for something. Humanity could not completely separate from what Azazel initiated, as the teachings, once integrated into human society, became ingrained in culture and transmitted through generations. When he was tied up, weapons didn't go away. The seductive decorations kept shining. Whispers of magic filled the shadows of human gatherings. Azazel's legacy lived on, but his judgment showed that God would never let sin go unchallenged. Even if all sin was symbolically linked to him, the human heart still bore the duty of deciding whether to follow his path or to deviate. By attributing all sin to Azazel, a significant lesson was imparted to both heaven and earth. Corruption does not emerge from nothingness. Rebellion against divine order gives birth to, nurtures, and spreads it. Azazel became the face of that rebellion. His name became a symbol that crossed generations and texts, teaching people that one act of defiance can tear apart the fabric of an entire world. The weight of guilt that he felt was not just punishment, it was also a cosmic message about how serious it is to lead creation astray. The profundity of this symbolism also elucidates the justice of God. Saying that Azazel was responsible for all sin did not mean that people were not free. It meant that God had dealt with the root of corruption directly. Instead of letting people suffer under the weight of unseen evil, God showed who was responsible and put him in jail. This was both a punishment and a promise. The source of sin could be faced, and its embodiment could be stopped. For a tired world full of violence and moral decay, this meant there was hope, that corruption would not go unchecked, and that justice would reach even the most violent parts of rebellion. Even now, the phrase has meaning when you read it. It reminds us that sin is not just a personal mistake. It is part of a larger evil that wants to spread through families, societies, and generations. Azazel's legacy was that of a teacher of destruction, but his punishment was a reminder that even the worst corruption doesn't last forever. The story made him the symbol of everything that twists and defiles by saying that all sin was his fault. At the same time, it showed that God's judgment is strong enough to collect all of that weight and throw it into the abyss. So, Azazel's story is more than just the story of one person who fell. It tells the story of how sin grew, spread, and was judged. When people said all sin was ascribed to Azazel, they were painting a picture of all the bad things that happened in his name. His name became a short way to say rebellion, moral collapse, and the twisting of creation. And when he was tied up and buried in the dark of the desert, people were given a vision of hope. The promise that sin, no matter how strong, would always be judged by the one who made the heavens and the earth. Azazel's fall wasn't a quick event, like a candle going out in the wind. It was a slow process of glory turning into ruin. At one time, he stood among the watchers, glowing with the light of heaven and wearing the authority of someone who had been given divine secrets. He was made for light, but he chose to go into the dark. His fall was not just the loss of wings or beauty. It was the giving up of purpose, the corruption of intention, and the turning of a being made for service into one that embodied rebellion. This journey from angel to fallen spirit isn't just about Azazel, it's also about how pride, desire, and misusing knowledge can turn something that was once pure into a symbol of destruction. Azazel's spiritual defeat went deeper than just being chained up or buried under the sands of Dudel. His defeat started in his own heart long before he was dragged into darkness. He had already broken the harmony of heaven within himself when he decided to share forbidden knowledge with people and turn divine secrets into weapons of war and tools of seduction. He didn't need any outside help to start his downfall. It all began with a choice and a spark of defiance. From then on, every action he took him further away from the light and deeper into corruption. One can see how different his start and end were on this journey. Azazel was a heavenly being who had been given the job of watching over creation and keeping divine order in check. He was supposed to guide and protect, but instead he took control and used others. What he had been given as sacred knowledge became twisted in his hands and turned into curses on all people. He didn't just fall from the sky. He brought with him the weight of many souls who followed his teachings. He had lost his spiritual battle when he became a corrupter instead of a guardian, a teacher of ruin instead of a servant of truth. You can also see how far he fell by looking at the symbolism of his binding. When Raphael was told to tie Azazel's hands and feet, cover him in darkness, and throw him into the desert, it was like what was happening to him spiritually. He was tied up because he was already a slave to his own rebellion. He was covered in darkness because he was already full of it. He was thrown into despair because he had chosen to make his life a desert of destruction. His punishment showed how he had changed. This was not only an external judgment, but also a visible sign of an internal collapse. Azazel's fall shows how ironic rebellion can be. He lost all real power when he tried to gain more. He gave people weapons and knowledge that promised power, but he lost the power that had been given to him in heaven. People stopped honoring him and started cursing his name. Angels had once stood by him in unity, but now even his fellow watchers were being judged because of the disease he spread. His loss was not just his own. It also affected everyone who had followed him down the path of corruption. This is where you can see his journey from angel to fallen spirit most clearly. The more he tried to get power, the less powerful he became. The way Azazel became a symbol is also connected to the images of his spiritual collapse. All sin was ascribed to Azazel, not because he was the only one guilty of every corrupt act, but because his name became a symbol of rebellion. His fall was not just a personal event, it was a cosmic testimony because he had to carry such a heavy weight. Azazel was a living example of how much corruption costs. The heavens, the earth, and people could all see him. He fell not just as a person, but as a symbol of what rebellion looks like when it runs its course. His loss was more than just personal. It was universal, ringing out through every generation that remember his name. The journey from angel to fallen spirit illustrates the essence of spiritual defeat. It encompasses not only divine judgment, but also the deprivation of purpose. Azazel had been made to praise the Creator, to lead creation, and to shine with light. He had no place in heaven or on earth after he chose to rebel. He became a wanderer, a chained shadow, and a presence that was defined by what he had lost instead of what he still had. So, his fall is described as both a descent and a stripping away. He was cast down and unmade in the sense that his purpose was forever ruined. Some people might also see his story as a reflection of humanity. Azazel fell by choosing to twist what was given to him, and people fall when they use knowledge and freedom to destroy instead of bring people together. His story serves as a cautionary tale, illustrating that the transition from purity to corruption is gradual, frequently initiated by minor decisions that cumulatively lead to disastrous consequences. People could look at Azazel's fall and see how easy it is for them to become proud, want power, or turn good things into harmful tools. So, Azazel's defeat became a story that showed what happens when someone gives up on their divine calling. The desert of Dudael, where he was held captive, also had a lot of meaning. Deserts are empty, hot, and lonely places where nothing lives. To throw Azazel there was to show that his soul had become that kind of place. He used to be full of heavenly life, but now he was a barren spirit, burned by the fire of his own rebellion. The desert was not only his prison, it was also a mirror of himself. It was a spiritual wasteland for someone who had chosen to leave the living waters of God's presence. His chains didn't just keep him from moving, they showed that he was already a prisoner of his own wrongdoing. Azazel's fall was not just about being trapped in darkness, it was also about losing what it means to be an angel. His wings may still have been there, but they didn't lift him up anymore. His beauty may still have been there, but it was covered up by corruption. Azazel's defeat was spiritual because it was permanent. He could never fulfill his purpose, return to the light, or fix the damage he had done. He went on a one-way trip down, changing from a guardian of heaven to a chained symbol of sin, buried in despair. The story of Azazel's spiritual defeat is one of the best examples of what happens when you rebel. He started out as a bright being who had been given knowledge and fame. He died as a fallen spirit, without honor, in chains, and people remembered him not for what he had been, but for what he had done wrong. His fall shows that even the highest people can be brought down by pride and rebellion to places where light does not reach. Dudael's chains were just the last sign of what was already in his heart, that Azazel had become the very image of defeat, a testimony written into the fabric of creation about what happens when you turn away from God. Before the flood, the world was full of corruption, and the actions of both angels and men had deeply damaged the purity of creation. People's hearts, which used to be pure and respectful, were now filled with greed, lust, violence, and the seductive teachings of Azazel. It wasn't a sudden darkness that fell over the earth. It was a creeping shadow that had grown over generations and become a part of every part of life. The giants, known as the Nephilim, walked the earth. They were not only huge in size, but also huge in the moral corruption that came from the forbidden knowledge that Azazel had spread. Every city was affected by the arts of seduction and ornamentation, and weapons of war were in every hand. It was as if the very fabric of humanity had been rewoven with threads of defiance and cruelty, a tapestry of moral decay that spread like wildfire across the continents. Azazel's power was a key part of this corruption. Before his teachings, people lived a simpler life that was more in tune with the rhythms of creation and the commands of the Most High. But with his gifts of knowledge, every act of rebellion found tools, every thought of desire found ways, and every desire to be in charge found tools. Weapons of war were no longer just things to help people stay alive. They became tools for killing and taking over. Jewelry and other decorations stopped being about beauty and started being about seduction and manipulation. Enchantments and root cuttings, which used to be neutral arts, became ways to do magic and trick people. Azazel's shadow over people was deep because he had shown them how to change their world, but not how to do it with good sense. As this corruption spread, it felt like the earth itself was groaning under the weight of moral decay. Rivers ran with blood, forests echoed with the cries of the oppressed, and cities shone with a false beauty that hid the rot underneath. Every generation made the mistakes of the last one worse. The giants were both a sign and a result of this huge change in the way things were supposed to be. They were the children of angels and humans. Their terrifying appearance was scary because it showed how much the fallen angels, especially Azazel, had affected the world. Not only was humanity's behavior wrong, but it was also biological. The corruption had gotten into the very flesh and bones of creation. The cries of the earth went up to heaven in both real and figurative ways. Angels saw the violence, the unfairness, and the abuse of the gifts of creation. They saw kids born into violence, trees cut down for fun, animals killed for fun, and communities ruled by fear and power. It wasn't just a small act of disobedience. It was a complete moral breakdown. The knowledge Azazel had given to hearts that chose greed and lust had made the effects many times worse. It was impossible to keep track of all the corrupt acts because it seemed like every man, woman, and child was involved in acts of rebellion and cruelty that were partly caused by the teachings of the fallen Watcher. This is when Azazel's part in the flood becomes clear. The choices that led to God's judgment weren't random. They were made in response to a corruption that was so widespread that it was affecting creation itself. The violence, the bloodshed, the lust, the sorceries, and the moral chaos all came from the spread of forbidden knowledge, which Azazel planted long ago. His power had changed people in such basic ways that the earth could no longer support the life it once did. The flood was not just a punishment for people. It was also a way for God to clean up a world that was full of corruption. It was an attempt to restore order by getting rid of the evil that had spread because of the fallen angel's interference. Azazel's power stayed strong even after the divine order was given. He hadn't walked the earth in hundreds of years, but his teachings could still be heard in every city, every sword, every body ornament, and every spell whispered under the moonlight. His fall didn't erase his impact, it just took away the source, leaving behind a legacy that had spread to the hearts of all people. The giants, who were scary and walked around, were a living proof of this power, and their presence made the Ming judgment even more necessary. The vision of creation that had once been so pure could no longer recognize humanity in its corrupted state. Noah, in this time, is a shining example of how bad Azazel's actions were. While others were bent by the weight of forbidden knowledge, Noah's heart stayed pure because he had faith, obeyed, and kept things simple. He is a symbol of the possibility of doing the right thing even when everything around you is corrupt. But even Noah couldn't stop the violence, lust, and destruction that had been going on for generations. The world had been changed, twisted by the power of forbidden knowledge, and the flood was needed to protect the seeds of real life. When you look at Azazel's actions in the context of the flood story, you can see a deep connection between knowledge, corruption, and divine justice. Azazel did not act alone to cause chaos. People had their own choices to make. But his teachings made every desire for greed, lust, and violence stronger, making the effects of every choice people made even worse. The earth, soaked in blood and sin, begged for help. The judgment that came after was both an end and a beginning. It put an end to the corrupt era and gave people a chance to fix what the fallen angel had messed up. Therefore, the context of the flood is inextricably linked to the deeds of Azazel. To comprehend the deluge that inundated the world, it is essential to recognize the cumulative impact of his corruption on humanity. He gave people the knowledge, the tools, and the temptations they needed, and they took them. This led to a world that was about to fall apart. The flood was both a punishment for people's sins and a punishment for the evil that the fallen angel had caused. This makes Azazel's role in the flood story clear. He is both the source of moral corruption and a symbol of the bad things that happen when divine wisdom is used wrong. Not only did every drop of rain that fell in the flood wash away the dirt on the ground, but it also symbolically erased the legacy of corruption that Azazel had started. But even in the flood, his influence would still be felt, reminding people in the future that the lessons of the past, the cost of sin, and the risks of misusing knowledge are never easy to forget. People would rebuild, but the memory of the fallen angel and the giants would live on, a reminder of how heavy rebellion is and how important divine judgment is. Corruption had left the world in a terrible state, but Noah and his family were like islands of light in an ocean of moral darkness. Azazel's teachings spread quickly through humanity, including warfare, seduction, enchantments, and forbidden arts. However, Noah's family was not tempted by these gifts. He didn't use weapons to get his way, and he didn't use jewelry or charms to get people to like him. Noah's life, on the other hand, was characterized by obedience, simplicity, and devotion to God's commands. In a world where fallen angels had twisted every human desire, Noah and his family stood out for having pure hearts and making strong choices. It wasn't by chance that they were pure. It was the result of a conscious choice to turn away from the temptation of misused knowledge and devote oneself to something else. Noah knew about the corruption that was all around him. The Watcher's power could be seen in the huge cities, the bloody fields, the giants that walked the land, and the temptations that whispered through every human desire. But he and his family were careful to protect their hearts, not because they didn't know how the world worked, but because they knew how dangerous it was to let bad information affect their actions. This made them the opposite of what Azazel taught. Noah's life was an example of restraint, humility, and the conscious choice to follow divine guidance. His knowledge had given people the power to destroy and manipulate. When you think about how much Azazel affects the world around Noah, the difference between him and the rest of the world becomes even clearer. The Watchers taught people how to make weapons, how to use beauty and jewelry to get what they wanted, and how to use magic and root cuttings to control others. These lessons had gotten into every part of human life. For whole generations, it had become normal to use knowledge for selfish reasons, changing creation to fit their needs instead of following God's plan. Noah, on the other hand, didn't need these tools. He didn't need power, charm, or magic to keep his family safe or to get a good place in God's eyes. His purity was like armor on the inside that protected him from the chaos and corruption around him. Routine and obedience gave Noah's family a quiet strength as well. Their lives followed a pattern that was in line with God's plan instead of what people made up. They built trust, patience, and humility in a world full of ambition and manipulation. This simple devotion, which most people didn't notice because they were corrupt, became their most important trait. It wasn't flashy or important to people, but it kept them from being affected by the moral decay that was spreading like a disease through the population. The difference is clear. Azazel's knowledge led to more sin, while Noah's obedience kept innocence and faithfulness alive, even in the midst of chaos. The spiritual importance of Noah's purity goes beyond just staying alive. It shows that even though the world is full of bad information, it is still possible to do the right thing if you choose to follow God's will. Noah and his family did not gain knowledge that was not allowed, nor did they use their surroundings to their own advantage. Instead, their purity was active. They worked to be good, stayed away from temptation, and accepted the simplicity of living within God's order. In doing this, they became a way for human life to go on, a living counterbalance to the destruction that Azazel's teachings had caused. Their loyalty also had an effect on the next generation. The story of Noah is not just about his own moral character. It is also about keeping a family line safe from the sins of the fallen angels. His kids learned to obey by watching him, and the home became a small version of God's favor. The purity of Noah's family was a safe place, a place where new beginnings could grow, while the giants and bad people walked the earth. The contrast with the wider human population shows how powerful Azazel's influence is. The more widespread the corruption, the more amazing it is that those who stay faithful stay strong. Noah's life is also a good example of what happens when knowledge is used wisely and when it is misused. Azazel and the other Watchers had given the world knowledge, secrets of creation, and skills, but people had used them wrong, turning gifts into weapons, seduction tools, and magic. Noah's family showed that divine instruction has a kind of power that lasts and protects, even if it is simpler and less immediately useful. His purity served as a protective barrier for both his family and the continuation of humanity, safeguarding the essence of creation through steadfastness. The difference between Noah and the sinful world also shows that every person has a moral choice to make. The Watchers' teachings gave people the chance to learn and gain power, but in the end, it was the human heart that chose the way to go. Many had used the tools and sinned, but Noah chose to be obedient, hold back, and follow God's orders. This shows that even though outside forces can be strong, one's inner state and conscious choices shape the course of one's life. Noah's purity came from his wisdom in not using knowledge for bad things. He didn't lack access or understanding. He just valued doing the right thing above all else. Also, Noah's family shows that real safety and stability come from moral integrity, not worldly power. In a world filled with giants, war, and seduction, survival depended not on strength or cunning, but on following God's orders. Azazel's teachings may have given people quick ways to control, manipulate, and dominate others, but these tools cost lives, peace, and ultimate safety. Noah's family, on the other hand, was safe because they were faithful. Their purity was both their shield and their inheritance, showing that in a world full of corruption, moral clarity can protect life itself. Even though the flood was coming, Noah's family was still a beacon of difference. They were separate from the chaos of the world, free from the knowledge that had so deeply corrupted people. Their lives were full of quiet devotion, obedience, and steadfastness. They taught that purity is not the absence of challenge, but the presence of choice and discipline. In a world where Azazel's power was too much, Noah and his family showed that it was still possible to stay true to their faith and have a future that wasn't tainted by the evil of fallen angels. So the story of Noah and his family's purity shows how strong obedience and faithfulness can be. The difference between Azazel's teachings and the world around them was very clear. His knowledge caused destruction, but their purity saved lives. His influence caused a moral breakdown, but their dedication kept them in line with God's will. Noah's family shows that when there is a lot of corruption, the things that last are steadfastness, righteousness, and moral clarity. These things prepare the world for renewal and the continuation of creation itself. The judgment of Azazel, as depicted in the Ethiopian Book of Enoch, is a vision of harshness that echoes throughout heaven and earth. It is not just a punishment done in secret, it is a sign of God's justice, a visible punishment for the evil he had let loose. The imagery is powerful. A fire that is not normal burns forever, eating away at the darkness that has been with him for a long time without destroying the essence of creation itself. This fire is not like any fire that people have ever seen. It is a reflection of God's will and a way to get rid of the fallen angel, whose actions had caused destruction for generations. It was meant to make sure that the fallen angel would no longer have power over life or morality. The fire acts as a barrier and a reminder, showing that punishment lasts forever, not just for a short time. In this case, eternal punishment is not just a sentence of suffering, it is also a way of saying that the effects of rebellion will last forever. Azazel's actions had effects that spread like waves. People became corrupt, Giants walked the earth, and the land was filled with moral decay. The punishment he got was fair, given the seriousness and number of his crimes. It is a punishment that goes beyond being locked up. It has spiritual, moral, and cosmic aspects as well. The chains that hold him down, the darkness that surrounds him, and the fire that never goes out are all parts of a complete answer to his disobedience. The judgment is just as harsh as the corruption he started, and it will make sure that his power is gone forever. The imagery of fire in Azazel's eternal punishment is very meaningful. In many spiritual writings, fire stands for cleansing, light, and fairness. But here it is combined with darkness, chains, and solitude, which shows the duality of the punishment. It is meant to correct behavior, but also has an unchangeable element of pain. The fire does not destroy creation. Azazel's actions had already left their mark on the earth and on people. Instead, it holds him back and shows how strong God's response is to rebellion. Every flicker and spark is not just a flame. It is a statement. No knowledge, power, or influence, no matter how great, can escape the consequences of defiance when used against divine order. This everlasting judgment also elucidates the essence of divine justice as depicted in Enochic literature. It is very careful, steady, and perfectly balanced. The fire is final because the things that caused it were basic. Azazel had changed the natural order, corrupted human hearts, and brought chaos into creation. The fact that his punishment is eternal means that some wrongdoings, especially those that corrupt life itself, need a response that lasts forever. The punishment is a reflection of the crime because it will last forever, just like the moral damage he caused. When you think about Azazel's last fire, you can also feel the heaviness of being alone and cut off from the divine presence. Angels are made to live in light and serve God, and to do what God wants them to do. To fall from this state and then face eternal punishment in fire and darkness is to experience the severest estrangement from what once defined existence. The images are more than just physical, they show the complete breakdown of relationships and purpose. Azazel used to enjoy the light of heaven and the company of good people. Now he is surrounded by flames and shadows, trapped forever, a living proof of what happens when you rebel. When applied to Azazel, eternal punishment goes beyond the person. It teaches both angels and people the consequences of actions that go against God's plan. The fire burns as a lesson, a warning that misusing knowledge, corrupting others, and abusing gifts given by God will have consequences that can't be avoided or changed. Azazel's punishment is never-ending, unlike mortal consequences, which may fade or be less severe. This shows how serious his sins were and how different they are from those who, like Noah and his family, are still obedient and pure. The idea of eternal punishment is also connected to the story of cosmic balance. Azazel's rebellion had tipped the scales, letting sin and corruption grow. By tying him up in fire and darkness, the divine brings order back to the world. This means that while the things he did have changed history, he will never be able to corrupt anyone else again. The fire keeps the bad things from getting worse by keeping them in check and cleaning them up. This stops the bad things that have spread through knowledge, weapons, seduction, and sorcery from getting worse. It is a correction for the eyes and the spirit, reminding us that God's judgment keeps things in balance even when evil has spread. Widely Enochic visions give very detailed descriptions of the images in this punishment. Chains that look like iron snakes wrap around him, and fire that burns with divine intensity fills the darkness where he lives. The desert, or the empty area of Dudael, makes things worse. There is no food, no water, no plants, and only fire. Every part of the judgment adds to an idea of eternal consequence. This punishment, unlike mortal punishments, is not limited to lifespans and earthly experiences. It exists outside of time, showing both the seriousness of the crime and the unchanging nature of divine law. Azazel's last fire also shows how some actions can't be forgiven. When a person sins, they can repent, get help, and be restored. But when a fallen angel does something that causes corruption on a cosmic scale, the effects go beyond just fixing things in the present. Azazel's binding in eternal fire is final, which supports the idea that going against divine order has consequences that can't be undone when the offense is so great that it affects everyone. Even though the fire is terrifyingly strong, it teaches us an important lesson about cosmic justice. The universe can't stand unchecked corruption. Azazel's punishment is not only punitive but also corrective, as it inhibits further contamination. The flames that burn forever are both a seal and a statement. They show that divine law has ways to keep order, even when free will has been used to its fullest. The Ethiopian Book of Enoch conveys a profound lesson regarding the enduring nature of consequences when knowledge and power are misappropriated. Seeing Azazel in flames is also a reminder that the effects of rebellion are both quick and long-lasting. His fall, his teachings, the corruption of humanity, and finally his eternal punishment are all linked. The story makes it clear that actions have consequences, that using knowledge incorrectly can have effects that go far beyond what is immediately visible, and that divine judgment is total and complete when it happens. Every flicker of the eternal fire stands for both containment and the seriousness of the actions that led to such a response. This shows that the path of corruption always leads to consequences that can't be avoided. So the images of the last fire and eternal punishment are not just dramatic stories, they have moral and religious meaning. It shows how the cosmic order reacts to rebellion and corruption in a way that goes beyond what people can understand. Azazel's eternal punishment serves as a stark and enduring reminder of the repercussions of misused knowledge and disobedience, guaranteeing that, although the ramifications of his actions may resonate throughout history, his individual ability to inflict harm is eternally obliterated in the fires of divine justice. The Ethiopian tradition offers a distinct and intriguing interpretation of the narrative of Azazel and Enoch, characterized by a different emphasis and preservation compared to numerous other biblical traditions. The Ethiopian Book of Enoch carefully keeps the story of Azazel's rebellion and Enoch's journeys to heaven. This shows a worldview that places a high value on moral instruction, cosmic order, and the effects of misused knowledge. The Ethiopian canon offers a complete story of the Watchers, including the evil that Azazel caused, the rise of the Nephilim, and the good actions of divine agents, such as Enoch himself. This is different from other scriptural traditions, which only briefly mention or imply the story. This preservation is not only historical, it is also educational, providing layers of meaning about obedience, the correct use of knowledge, and the manifestation of divine justice. From an Ethiopian point of view, Azazel is more than a fallen angel. He is a sign of the risks of sharing knowledge without God's permission. The text explains how he taught people how to fight, seduce, and cast spells, and it stresses how bad things get when people use that knowledge for bad things. This story is kept in full because it is a warning story that shows what happens when people go against God. The Ethiopian tradition sees these events as real cosmic events with lasting spiritual meaning, not as myths or allegories. By writing down what Azazel did and how it affected people, the text shows how important divine order is, how angels act as intermediaries, and how heavy free will is when it comes to forbidden knowledge. In this tradition, Enoch is the opposite of the evil Azazel spread. He is the scribe, the messenger, and the observer who connects the earthly and the heavenly. The Ethiopian text has a lot of information about his trips to heaven, his revelations about the coming judgment, and his talks with angels. It shows readers how divine justice works in both the spiritual and material worlds. Enoch's story goes well with Azazel's story, giving us a way to understand and internalize the effects of rebellion. His role is important in the Ethiopian canon because it shows that righteousness is possible in a world full of corruption, and that divine knowledge can help instead of hurt. The choice to keep the story of Azazel and Enoch in the Ethiopian Bible also shows how important continuity and memory are in that culture. The Ethiopian Church kept the Book of Enoch whole, including its detailed stories about the Watchers. This is different from other traditions where some texts were lost or left out of canonical scripture. This preservation enabled subsequent generations to observe the narrative of insurrection, moral decay, and divine retribution in a manner that closely adhered to the original doctrines. The Ethiopian perspective thus emphasizes the moral and spiritual teachings inherent in the narrative, ensuring that readers comprehend the ramifications of deviating from divine guidance and the necessity of vigilance against corruption. The preservation is also due to the story's symbolic power in Ethiopian theology. Azazel's fall, the rise of the Nephilim, and the final judgment all serve as moral guides, showing people how to act and showing how obedience and protection are connected. The Ethiopian canon makes it clear that these aren't just historical events, they are spiritual truths that have been passed down through the ages. The Ethiopian tradition shows how important these lessons are by keeping the story whole. The story serves as a moral guide, reminding believers of the risks of forbidden knowledge, the duties that come with free will, and the need to follow God's will even when there are many temptations in the world. Additionally, the retention of this narrative in the Ethiopian Bible is associated with the Church's historical and cultural milieu. Ethiopia has long had its own Christian tradition that is not as affected by the theological and textual choices that shaped other parts of the Christian world. Because of this, texts like the Book of Enoch, which were not included in other canons, stayed important in Ethiopian thought. This made it possible for the community to keep detailed records of Azazel's corruption and Enoch's revelations, making sure that these stories could be passed down through the ages without any changes. The story serves both a spiritual and a cultural purpose, strengthening the identity of the Ethiopian faithful and their link to a long, unbroken tradition of Scripture. The moral lessons in Azazel's story are especially powerful from an Ethiopian point of view because they show what happens when people misuse divine knowledge. In contrast to other traditions that might shorten or use symbols in the story, the Ethiopian text carefully shows how Azazel's teachings led to the Nephilim's corruption, the violence and seduction between people, and finally, God's judgment. The text does this to show how rebellion and misusing knowledge can have big effects. Enoch's role as an observer and recorder reinforces this moral framework, emphasizing the significance of testimony, accountability, and the dissemination of divine insight. Keeping this story alive also serves a religious and educational purpose. In Ethiopian culture, people don't just read the Book of Enoch as history. They also use it as a living text that helps them think about morals, ethics, and spirituality. Azazel's rebellion and Enoch's reactions are good examples for teaching, meditating, and telling stories. These stories have strong images and easy-to-understand lessons that help people understand the effects of sin, the value of obedience, and the importance of moral discernment. The Ethiopian Bible keeps the whole story, which means that these lessons are always available in their most useful and rich form. Lastly, the Ethiopian view keeps the story of Azazel and Enoch alive because it shows how divine justice and human responsibility work together. Azazel's corruption of humanity illustrates the peril of unrestrained influence, whereas Enoch's righteousness exemplifies the capacity for virtuous existence amid turmoil. The story gives a complete picture of the moral structure of creation. Disobedience has consequences, obedience protects, and knowledge, when guided by God's plan, can lead to wisdom instead of destruction. The Ethiopian Bible keeps these stories alive to give a complete moral and spiritual framework that connects the heavenly and earthly, the angelic and human, and the past, with moral lessons that are still being taught. The Ethiopian tradition keeps the story of Azazel and Enoch alive, so that it can continue to teach, warn, and guide people for years to come. It stresses how important it is to be morally vigilant, the dangers of corruption, and the lasting strength of obedience and righteousness. The story is still a living example of what happens when you misuse knowledge and how divine justice can bring things back into balance. It is a story that is both cautionary and instructive for Christians in Ethiopia, and it is deeply woven into their spiritual and cultural lives. Azazel in the Ethiopian Book of Enoch becomes a symbol that means much more than just who he is. He embodies the fundamental origin of sin, the initial source from which corruption permeates the human realm. His actions are not just acts of rebellion. They are what cause moral decay, seduction, violence, and the twisting of knowledge. He laid the groundwork for human and angelic corruption to thrive by teaching people the secrets of war, the arts of seduction, and the dark mysteries of sorcery. In this way, Azazel's influence goes far beyond his own rebellion. It has affected the hearts and actions of generations of people whose lives became full of sin as a result. He represents the initial instance of moral deviation, the source from which innumerable subsequent transgressions and ethical disintegration can be traced. Azazel's role as the source of sin is made stronger by the fact that he is the opposite of people who followed God's will or stayed true to it. Noah and Enoch, for example, are moral opposites because they show restraint, devotion, and following divine guidance. Azazel disseminates knowledge for personal gain and corruptive influence, whereas these virtuous figures utilize their understanding for preservation, enlightenment, and alignment with the divine will. By pointing out this difference, the Ethiopian text shows that sin is not just an abstract idea, but a real force that comes from using God's gifts and freedoms in the wrong way. Azazel is the personification of that force, the living root from which moral decay branches outward. When you compare Azazel to other fallen figures like Lucifer, it makes his symbolic role even more interesting. Lucifer, frequently portrayed as the insubordinate angel whose arrogance and quest for dominion precipitated his downfall, symbolizes a distinct category of sin grounded in self-aggrandizement and jealousy. Azazel, on the other hand, represents a more insidious kind of corruption, one that goes after people directly and uses their curiosity, desire, and ambition to spread evil. Lucifer's rebellion goes against the order of heaven and the hierarchy of God, while Azazel's actions ruin the human world by teaching people how to lie, cheat, and destroy. In this way, Azazel's symbolic importance is closely linked to the mortal world, showing how sin can enter human life through temptation, knowledge, and the wrong use of divine gifts. The Ethiopian story makes it clear that Azazel's corruption is not just a one-time thing. He doesn't just sin for his own sake. He actively teaches others things that will lead them to sin. Under his direction, weapons, sorcery, seduction, and ornaments become tools of moral decay. People who aren't ready to use such power responsibly fall into patterns of violence, desire, and chaos. This systemic effect strengthens his position as the source of sin. He is not merely an individual transgressor, but the catalyst of pervasive corruption that alters society, culture, and even the natural order through the Nephilim and other ramifications of his doctrines. Azazel's symbolic function is also connected to the idea of being responsible. The Ethiopian text carefully follows his actions, showing how one person's rebellion can have long-lasting effects. This is different from the stories of other fallen figures, which are more about pride or ambition. By placing Azazel's fall in the context of both angelic and human transgression, the story shows a moral web in which actions have far-reaching effects. Sin is not an abstract principle. It is a living, acting force that originated from Azazel's rebellion and is evident in every subsequent act of corruption influenced by his teachings. Azazel's punishment and eternal imprisonment add even more meaning to his symbolism. The story makes it clear that the root of sin can't go on unchecked by tying him up in chains, darkness, and fire. The images of eternal punishment show how serious it is to start corruption at its source, showing that the effects of such actions are both immediate and long-lasting. To stop the spread of sin, Azazel, who represents its source, must be completely contained. This sets him apart from other fallen figures, whose punishment may be harsh but not necessarily seen as a way to fix the systemic corruption too had Azazel caused in the human world. Azazel's position as the origin of sin offers a framework for comprehending human susceptibility. The Ethiopian text depicts humanity as intrinsically malleable, susceptible to the knowledge and influence of formidable entities. Azazel takes advantage of this weakness to show how sin can get into people's lives through misused gifts, unchecked curiosity, and moral weakness. Unlike Lucifer, whose rebellion is often seen as personal pride or cosmic ambition, Azazel's sin is relational. It hurts others, teaches them wrong, and starts cycles of corruption that last for generations. His symbolic significance resides in his ability to catalyze a sequence of moral degradation. The story also looks at how knowledge and sin affect each other. Azazel is not just a teacher of things that are wrong, he is a figure whose lessons are dangerous because they separate understanding from moral responsibility. People who aren't ready for the power he gives them become corrupt, and the Nephilim are the most extreme example of this. This is very different from other fallen figures, whose actions may be more private or isolated. Azazel's teachings are performative, relational, and ultimately destructive, establishing him as the originator of sin in a communal and societal context, rather than as an individualistic rebellion. The Ethiopian view also puts Azazel in a bigger cosmological context by connecting him to both heavenly and earthly realms. Other fallen angels, like Lucifer, mostly try to upset the divine order in heaven. Azazel, on the other hand, has an effect on people, civilization, and culture. He ruins systems, spreads harmful knowledge, and starts the decline of morality. In this way, he is shown to be the archetype of sin's origin, the first source of wrongdoing that connects the heavenly and earthly worlds and leaves a lasting mark on both. The story shows how complicated rebellion and sin are by comparing Azazel to other fallen figures. Lucifer stands for pride, ambition, and a challenge from the heavens. Azazel stands for corruption, seduction, and moral decay in the human world. They all show different sides of wrongdoing, but Azazel is important because he is the root of all corruption. This shows that the root of sin can have effects that go far beyond the person who commits it. His symbolic presence in the Ethiopian text strengthens the moral duty to resist temptation, utilize knowledge judiciously, and maintain vigilance against corruption at all strata of existence. In conclusion, Azazel's representation as the origin of sin is profoundly ingrained in the Ethiopian narrative. He is not just a fallen angel, he is the source of corruption in both humans and angels, the first cause of moral decay on a large scale, and the teacher whose knowledge was used wrongly to change generations. His impact is systemic, relational, and long-lasting, which shows how dangerous it is to misuse gifts and how important it is to stay in line with divine order. The Ethiopian Book of Enoch uses this symbolism to teach deep lessons about how sin starts, how rebellion spreads, and how knowledge and power come with moral responsibility. The Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur has one of the most interesting and lasting references to Azazel. The scapegoat ceremony has fascinated scholars and believers for hundreds of years. In this ritual, which is described in Leviticus, 2 goats are chosen on the Day of Atonement. One is sacrificed to God, and the other is sent into the wilderness for Azazel. The goat that is sent away carries the sins of the community, symbolically carrying guilt and wrongdoing out of the camp. Some traditions have long linked this mysterious figure, Azazel, to the fallen angel in Enochic literature. This makes a connection between the Ethiopian stories of cosmic rebellion and the practical rituals of human repentance. The goat, which wanders into the empty wilderness, becomes a living symbol of removal, purification, and the real effects of sin. This is similar to the story of the angel whose actions brought corruption into the human world. Azazel's role as a teacher of forbidden knowledge and a corrupter of mankind is similar to the role of the scapegoat in the story of Enoch. Azazel represents the sin and moral corruption that must be kept away from both heaven and earth, just like the goat carries away sin from the Israelites. The Yom Kippur ritual, which is mostly about people making up for their wrongs, has the same cosmic theme. Wrongdoings have a real presence, they weigh on the community, and they must be dealt with and removed. The symbolic banishment of the goat into the wilderness can be seen as a ritual echo of the binding and banishment of Azazel in the Ethiopian Book of Enoch. The pictures of the wilderness are especially powerful. The goat is sent to a deserted, empty place in the Bible so that the sins it carries can't come back to the people. In Enoch, Azazel is also thrown into Dudale, a barren and isolated area, where he is chained up and surrounded by darkness and fire. Both stories stress the importance of separation and containment, showing that in order to restore order and holiness, the source of corruption must be isolated. This parallel emphasizes a significant continuity between ritual and myth, human observance and cosmic justice, reinforcing the notion that sin possesses both spiritual and practical dimensions, necessitating its deliberate exclusion from the realm of the righteous. The link between the scapegoat and Azazel also shows how both traditions have a lasting moral lesson. In Enoch, Azazel's teachings corrupt humanity by introducing violence, seduction, and sorcery. The Yom Kippur ritual, on the other hand, externalizes communal guilt by putting it in a physical vessel. In both situations, sin is recognized and given shape. The goat acts as a middleman, just like Azazel did in the past, but in the opposite way. Azazel spread corruption, but the scapegoat takes it in and carries it away, letting the community clean itself up and bring back peace. This dynamic encapsulates a fundamental theological principle. Transgressions must be addressed, contained, and either symbolically or literally eradicated to preserve moral equilibrium. The ritual also shows how people need to think about and deal with guilt, which is similar to the story in Enoch where divine agents are in charge of keeping order. The high priest touches the goat and confesses the people's sins on Yom Kippur. Then he lets it go into the wilderness. The act is very physical and real, and it gives people a way to see how to get rid of bad behavior. In the Enochic narrative, angels such as Raphael are tasked with restraining Azazel and supervising the containment of corruption. Both stories show a world in which moral wrongdoing is not ignored or abstracted. Instead, it is actively dealt with, either through ritual or cosmic intervention. The Ethiopian Book of Enoch adds more connections. Azazel is shown as the source of weapons, seduction, and forbidden knowledge. His fall taints the human world, so it must be contained and punished. The Yom Kippur ritual has a goat that takes the people's sins into the wilderness, which represents getting rid of moral pollution. Scholars and religious thinkers have long conjectured that the Azazel, referenced in Leviticus, may represent a remnant of the ancient recollection of this insubordinate angel, sustained through ritual language and symbolism. This interpretation stresses that traditions, even if they are separated by time and space, still have a common theme. Sin is externalized, responsibility is recognized, and restoration is achieved through planned, structured action. The ritual also shows that sin and responsibility are things that affect everyone. Azazel's corruption in Enoch has an impact on whole groups of people, changing society in ways that are both moral and physical. The scapegoat ritual on Yom Kippur also deals with the guilt of the whole community, not just the sins of one person. The community collectively recognizes wrongdoing by sending the goat into the wilderness, symbolically transferring the burden of sin to an outside force. Both stories say that sin isn't just a personal thing. It has effects on society and the universe as a whole. To deal with it, you need to recognize it, contain it, and find a way to bring balance back to both the moral and physical worlds. The ritual also emphasizes the ideas of cleansing and starting over, which are similar to what happened to Azazel when he fell. The actions of the fallen angel required divine intervention to avert further corruption. Similarly, the scapegoat functions as a pragmatic tool to inhibit the proliferation of moral disorder. The community can keep doing good things because it is exiled, which gets rid of the sins it represents. In this way, the ritual is a small version of the bigger story of the universe. Sin cannot go unpunished, whether in the heavens, on earth, or in human communities, and steps must be taken to restore balance. Additionally, Azazel's symbolism in both the Ethiopian story and the Yom Kippur ritual highlights the conflict between knowledge, power, and duty. In Enoch, Azazel uses knowledge to ruin and destroy. In the ritual, the goat takes away things that could otherwise break up the community. Both stories deal with the idea that moral consequences are real and can only be handled by carefully keeping them contained. These stories make it clear that sin is real and that something needs to be done to get rid of its effects. Lastly, the link between the scapegoat and Azazel shows how important the figure is in religious thought. Enoch's Azazel is thrown into darkness and fire, but the ritual Azazel goat is set free in the wilderness, carrying the burden of human guilt. Both stories use physical images to get across moral truths. Sin has a source, it spreads, and it needs to be dealt with. The connection between cosmic punishment and human ritual shows a deep understanding of moral cause and effect. It links the heavens with human practice and shows how ancient traditions keep lessons about responsibility, accountability, and the effects of wrongdoing alive in both spiritual and social settings. The early Christian interpretations of Azazel show how ideas changed over time. The figure of the fallen angel moved from Jewish and Enochic traditions to the theological writings of the Church Fathers. The Ethiopian Book of Enoch meticulously preserved the narrative of Azazel. However, early Christian authors interacted with the story selectively, frequently highlighting its moral and allegorical aspects over its literal cosmic occurrences. For numerous church fathers, Azazel evolved into a symbol of sin, corruption, and the perils of disobedience, rather than serving as a principal figure in a literal narrative of angelic rebellion. His narrative served as a profound illustration of the repercussions of pride, transgression, and the abuse of knowledge, themes that profoundly aligned with early Christian moral instruction. Some church fathers, such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Origen, alluded to Azazel indirectly by talking about the Watchers and fallen angels. They emphasized how these beings could corrupt people, using Azazel's actions as a warning to all people. In this context, Azazel was often linked to the teaching of forbidden knowledge that caused people to sin. For example, Origen read the story as an allegory, stressing how spiritually dangerous it is to turn away from God's guidance and accept false knowledge. This interpretation emphasized the moral and spiritual lessons derived from Azazel's rebellion rather than the literal specifics of his actions, reflecting the Church Fathers' preoccupation with ethical education and the development of virtue. Irenaeus, in particular, used the story of the Watchers to talk about why there is evil in the world. He thought of Azazel as a strong person whose rebellion showed how dangerous pride and disobedience can be, both for angels and for people. Irenaeus said that the evil that Azazel and his friends brought into the world showed what happens when people turn away from God's order. In this reading, the story connected cosmic events to human morality, which supported the idea that sin has real consequences and that following God's rules is necessary to keep both spiritual and earthly order. The emphasis on moral implications over historical specifics illustrates a prevailing trend in early Christian thought. Utilizing the narrative symbolically to educate, warn, and direct adherents in ethical behavior, in the 2nd century, Justin Martyr wrote about fallen angels in his apologetic works. He linked their rebellion to the beginning of human sin and corruption. Even though he didn't always say Azazel's name, the figure is implied in talks about angels who taught people forbidden arts and caused violence, which is similar to the story of Enoch. Justin's use of these stories had two goals: to help a Greco-Roman audience understand why evil exists in the world and to show how Christian teaching is based on a moral framework. Azazel, as a symbol, helped Justin show how knowledge, power, and rebellion could cause a lot of corruption when they don't follow God's will, which was an early Christian moral concern. Tertullian, another important church father, used these traditions in his work on the beginnings of sin and the moral dangers of the body. He talked about the fall of angels, saying that they taught people forbidden knowledge and showing how these beings can be disruptive and corrupting. According to Tertullian, Azazel was a moral archetype, a figure whose pride and defiance had effects not just on the angelic realm, but also on people. By focusing on the relational and causal effects of Azazel's rebellion, Tertullian bolstered a theological perspective that views sin as both inherited and relational, influencing generations through the actions of transgressors who corrupt divine gifts. Origen's allegorical method offered an additional perspective for interpreting Azazel in early Christianity. He examined the story as a spiritual lesson, stressing the risks of pride, disobedience, and the improper use of knowledge. For Origen, Azazel was a warning to both clergy and lay people about what happens when you turn away from God's light and guidance. The Church Fathers often stressed moral lessons more than literal readings of Enochic texts. However, the basic story, the corruption of humanity, the teaching of forbidden arts, and the punishment from God, still had an effect. This method made it possible for the story of Azazel to be included in Christian thought, while also fitting into theological frameworks that put a lot of emphasis on morality, allegory, and instruction. Early Christian interpretations sometimes linked Azazel to the larger cosmic fight between good and evil, in addition to moral allegory. The Church Fathers could show how spiritual forces and human choices affect each other by making him a key figure in the chain of rebellion that brought sin into the world. This interpretation emphasized the constancy of divine justice and the inevitability of repercussions for disobedience. The story of Azazel served as both a cosmic explanation and a moral lesson, connecting human experience to bigger spiritual truths. Ephraim, the Syrian's writings also show how early Christians were interested in Azazel. Ephraim used poetic and homiletic language to talk about what happens when angels rebel. He made Azazel's actions seem like both a warning and a story about how the universe works. His thoughts focused on the story's moral and relational aspects, showing Azazel as a person whose evil deeds had effects on all of creation. Ephraim's work shows how early Christians used Enochic material in religious, educational, and devotional settings, which allowed the figure of Azazel to influence both theological thought and spiritual practice. It is also noteworthy that early Christian thought preserved the focus on Azazel's role in imparting forbidden knowledge. The Ethiopian Enoch gives these lessons literally, talking about weapons, seduction, and sorcery. But the Church Fathers often saw these lessons as metaphors. The focus changed to the moral duty of people to act on what they know and what they can do. Azazel became a symbol of temptation and wrong direction. His power could be countered by being faithful, virtuous, and following God's will. This symbolic reading kept the story relevant in places that were very different from the historical and cultural settings of the Enochic text. In general, early Christian interpretations of Azazel show how people adapted and integrated. The Church Fathers interacted with the figure to underscore moral teachings, spiritual responsibility, and the repercussions of insubordination. Azazel's story gave early Christian communities a way to talk about human sin, angelic wrongdoing, and divine justice that was easy to understand, helpful, and important to them. These interpretations kept the core of Azazel's role while changing it to fit the theological and educational needs of the early church by turning the story into an allegory, a lesson in morality, and a cosmic illustration. Azazel persisted as a symbol of caution and moral exemplification through these writings. Although detached from the literal account of the Ethiopian Enoch, his impact endured in discourses concerning sin, corruption, and the relational repercussions of insurrection. The early Christians' interest in Azazel made him a powerful archetype, showing how his story is still important in moral, religious, and spiritual ways. Islamic traditions, although not directly mentioning Azazel in the Quran, frequently encompass narratives and interpretations that closely correspond with the themes related to him in the Ethiopian book of Enoch and Jewish writings. In numerous tafsir, Quranic exegeses, and subsequent Islamic literature, the character of Iblis, the defiant jinn or angelic entity who transgressed Allah's commands, is occasionally likened to Azazel owing to their common function as catalysts of sin and moral decay. Iblis, akin to Azazel, is depicted as a being who, despite a superior position, opts for defiance over compliance, thus becoming the source of human moral challenges. This parallel is especially clear in the focus on how people misuse knowledge and how they are tempted. Azazel taught people how to do things that were against the law, and Iblis encourages people to be disobedient and sin. This shows that there is a cosmic tempter or corrupter in all cultures. Some Islamic scholars, referencing Judeo-Christian texts or oral traditions, assert that Azazel may have been among the angels or entities who fell due to pride or transgression prior to human creation or during initial engagements with humanity. These interpretations frequently emerge in commentaries that aim to reconcile Quranic teachings with prior scriptural traditions, emphasizing parallels in the cosmic conflict between obedience and rebellion. The story stresses the effects of ignoring divine guidance, saying that disobedience is the first thing that leads to moral problems for people in the long run. In this way, Azazel is a cultural and religious archetype that goes by different names and has different traits in different religions, but always plays the same symbolic role. A cross-cultural comparison shows that people see Azazel or Azazel-like figures in different ways. In the Ethiopian Enoch, Azazel is a fallen angel who actively corrupts humanity by teaching forbidden knowledge, creating the Nephilim, and introducing weapons, seduction, and sorcery. In Jewish tradition, the Yom Kippur scapegoat ritual remembers him by symbolically removing him to take away sin. This emphasizes purification and communal responsibility. Early Christian thinkers saw him as a moral archetype, focusing on how he spread sin and corruption and taught lessons about pride, obedience, and responsibility. Islamic tradition emphasizes Iblis or Shaitan, yet retains the concept of a figure whose insurrection and influence present moral dilemmas, temptations, and tribulations for humanity. The main ideas are still the same in all of these cultures: where sin comes from, how knowledge or power can be misused, and how divine or communal help is needed to bring order back. In Tafsir, Iblis's refusal to bow to Adam is often seen as a turning point that shows pride and disobedience, just like Azazel's defiance in Enoch. Some Islamic commentaries indicate that specific angels or entities enticed humans with knowledge or misled them, analogous to Azazel's doctrines of armament, seduction, and sorcery. The concept remains coherent. Sin originates from a rebellious angel, a jinn, or a malevolent force, resulting in moral degradation and societal upheaval. This similarity across cultures strengthens the idea of Azazel as a cause of moral and ethical decline, showing that the story of a cosmic corrupter is true for everyone. Cultural transmission also shows how different things are important to different people. The Ethiopian Enoch has a lot of details about the angelic hierarchy, specific teachings, and the Nephilim that came from them, as well as Azazel's final punishment. Jewish and Christian traditions frequently underscore symbolic and moral teachings, portraying Azazel as a cautionary archetype whose actions exemplify the comprehension of sin and its repercussions. Islamic traditions, although they occasionally retain intricate narratives via folklore or comprehensive tafsir, predominantly emphasize the spiritual and ethical ramifications, employing figures such as Iblis to exemplify the perils of pride, disobedience, and temptation. Each culture modifies the narrative to align with theological, moral, and communal frameworks. Yet the fundamental themes remain remarkably consistent. The concept of testing and trial is fundamental in numerous Islamic exegeses. Iblis, similar to Azazel, serves as an intermediary in the cosmic narrative, presenting humanity with the dichotomy of obedience and transgression. The repercussions of yielding to temptation are emphasized repeatedly, reflecting the teachings derived from Azazel's impact on humanity in Enoch. In both cases, the stories show that sin is a relational thing. The corrupting figure affects others, people react to knowledge or temptation, and the behavior that follows has moral and sometimes physical effects. This framework underscores that sin is not solely an individual transgression, but a relational occurrence, a ripple effect originating from a principal source of insurrection. The symbolism of wilderness and solitude is also present in many cultures. Azazel is punished for his corruption by being bound in Dudail, a barren area, in Enoch. During Yom Kippur, the scapegoat is sent into the wilderness to get rid of the sins of the whole community. In Islamic stories, Iblis is kicked out of paradise but is allowed to walk the earth, where he tempts people and interacts with the world outside of God's presence. Each iteration highlights the conflict between containment and influence, demonstrating how rebellious individuals are both penalized and able to shape the moral framework of humanity. The wilderness transforms into a liminal space, symbolizing both exile and continuous engagement with the human realm. Cross-cultural comparison also shows that people have different ideas about agency and responsibility. In the Ethiopian Enoch, Azazel's rebellion is intentional and proactive, highlighting his function as an agent of corruption. In Jewish Yom Kippur customs, the goat symbolizes human sin, underscoring collective accountability and the potential for atonement. Early Christian interpretations frequently emphasize moral instruction, depicting Azazel as a figure whose influence underscores the imperative of obedience and spiritual vigilance. Islamic thought, viewed through the perspective of Iblis, underscores the relational and ethical ramifications of disobedience, concentrating on human accountability in the presence of temptation. These viewpoints collectively demonstrate a consensus. Sin arises from defiance, proliferates through interaction, and necessitates organized intervention to avert continuous moral deterioration. The comparative study also shows how Azazel and similar figures shape larger cosmologies. In Enoch, his fall is part of a bigger story about angels, showing how rebellion in heaven can have effects on earth. Jewish and Christian adaptations focus on the relational and allegorical parts, linking human morality to divine justice. Islamic interpretations, though occasionally less direct regarding Azazel, incorporate analogous themes through Iblis and the interplay of sin, obedience, and divine trial. Throughout these traditions, the narrative emphasizes a coherent lesson. Moral corruption is not an abstraction, but arises from discernible forces or entity, whose actions resonate within both human and cosmic realms. Ultimately, looking at Azazel in different cultures shows how universal the archetype is. The figure represents the source of moral deviation, the abuse of knowledge, and the relational consequences of transgression. Whether as a literal fallen angel, a ritual symbol, a moral exemplar, or a spiritual adversary. The Ethiopian, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic narratives each offer distinct perspectives. However, they collectively assert that sin possesses origins, consequences, and methods for containment or remediation. Azazel's presence in these cultural and religious contexts demonstrates a persistent human fascination with comprehending evil, accountability, and the complexities of ethical and spiritual existence. The story of Azazel, which is found in the Ethiopian Book of Enoch, is more than just a story about a fallen angel. It is a warning to people about the dangers of misusing knowledge and letting their desires run wild. Azazel's rebellion shows how power can be tempting and how knowledge that is kept secret or forbidden can be seductive. When he came down to earth and talked to people, he brought ideas and skills that were too hard for mortals to understand. Weapons of war, ways to seduce, and magic became available, and with them came corruption that was not planned, but was unavoidable. The moral lesson is clear. Knowledge isn't bad on its own, but when it's not paired with wisdom, humility, and moral limits, it can be used to do bad things. People are naturally curious and ambitious, so they took in these teachings, often without realizing what would happen next. This shows that how knowledge is received and used can lead to greed and moral decay. Azazel's impact on humanity acts as a mirror that shows how weak people are. When he taught people how to fight, they started to use their creativity to kill instead of keep living. While the skills of making weapons and fighting could be neutral or even protective, they became tools of oppression and violence when ambition and self-interest took over. When Azazel showed people how to dress up, seduce, and manipulate others, he also made them vain and desireful, which changed the way people interacted with each other and made moral tension rise. These teachings, which may seem harmless or even empowering on their own, together created a culture that was more and more full of greed, lust, and conflict. The story shows a deep truth about people. Knowledge without moral guidance makes the darker parts of the soul stronger, which leads to cycles of corruption and suffering in society. One of the most interesting things about Azazel's story is how it shows how greed and misusing knowledge can hurt relationships. His teachings were not isolated, they disseminated through communities, influencing successive generations. The Nephilim, giants that came from the interaction between humans and angels, are a sign of how breaking the rules can have far-reaching effects. The moral fabric of humanity began to disintegrate as the progeny of illicit unions represented both strength and devastation, authority and instability. The giants, which were both awe-inspiring and scary, were a direct result of what Azazel taught. This supports the idea that actions based on pride, ambition, or curiosity can have effects that go beyond the present moment. Azazel's story essentially serves as a protracted lesson on accountability. Once knowledge is imparted, it cannot be retracted, and the consequences of its misuse frequently endure for generations. The story is also a way to think about tempta, tian, and desire. Azazel's interactions with humans show how curiosity and attraction can make it hard to think clearly. People were drawn to the knowledge not just because of what it was, but also because of the power and status it could bring. This is similar to what happens today, when people are given skills, information, or chances without knowing how they fit into the moral framework. Greed can take over quickly. The story makes the reader or listener think about where their desires come from and how they go about getting ahead. Are we trying to learn so that we can grow in a responsible way, or are we drawn to the idea of power, control, or personal gain? Azazel's legacy is both external and internal. It has an effect on both societies and people's morals and spirituality. Another part of the story is about the difference between freedom and guidance. Azazel is a bad example of a mentor because he teaches people not to help them, but to rebel against him and have fun. This shows how dangerous it is to have power without being held accountable. In contrast, divine instruction, as Enoch experiences, stresses moral integrity, obedience, and harmony. People have free will, but they often don't know where their knowledge comes from or what it's for. This lack of understanding can lead to moral compromise. The story stresses that discernment is just as important as knowledge. To stay safe in the world, people need to know not only what they can learn, but also why they are being taught. Without this kind of awareness, curiosity and ambition go from being tools for growth to being tools for destruction. Azazel's actions have effects on society as a whole. Greed and the wrong use of knowledge cause social inequality, violence, and moral decay once they are introduced. When ambition isn't kept in check by conscience, communities split apart, power becomes concentrated, and moral standards fall apart. The story is old, but it still applies to problems we face today. Technology, science, and politics all have the potential to be abused, just like Azazel's teachings have always taught us. Knowledge that isn't based on morals can be dangerous because it can lead to both progress and destruction. Azazel's story also makes us think about our own responsibility. He was the catalyst, but people chose to follow his teachings. This duality underscores a fundamental ethical principle. External influence does not exempt internal responsibility. Greed arises not merely from Azazel's directive, but due to humanity's decision to internalize and act upon it without limitation. So the story makes people think about how they deal with knowledge, power, and desire in their own lives. The cautionary tale transcends historical or mythological frameworks, evolving into a reflection on the human condition and the ethical management of curiosity and ambition. Finally, the story of Azazel shows how important it is to find a balance between discovery and discipline. People need knowledge, curiosity, and ambition to grow, but they also need to think about what they do, be moral, and know what will happen. Azazel's fall and the corruption of people that followed show the cost of imbalance. When desire outweighs caution and guidance is misused, the effects are both immediate and long-lasting. The story makes people think quietly about where they get their knowledge, why they do what they do, and the moral rules that guide their decisions. Azazel shows us how knowledge, temptation, and responsibility are all connected in a deep way, and how wisdom is always linked to honesty and self-control. When we look at the story of Azazel in this way, it reminds us that every time we learn something new, there is a moral aspect to it. The lessons in his story are not just historical or symbolic. They are living reminders of how people can grow and become corrupt. When guided by morals, curiosity can lift and enlighten. Curiosity, when driven by self-interest and unrestrained desire, can wreak havoc. Azazel's story is still a mirror that shows how people have struggled with knowledge, greed, and moral choice throughout history. The desert went on forever, a huge area of shifting sands and whispering winds where the sun's unending gaze bore down on the empty ground. Azazel was stuck in this lonely place, far from the eyes of both men and angels. He was chained by orders that were as old as the heavens themselves. The chains, made from divine will and unbreakable in their strength, wrapped around him like a circle that would never break. They dug into his body and held him in place with a quiet, unbreakable authority. The desert was strangely quiet. The silence was so deep that even the tiniest rustle of sand sounded like the world was holding its breath. This was a silence that spoke of judgment, being alone, and consequences that were long ago but will always be there. Every grain of sand under the endless sky was a reminder of the rebellion that had once pierced the heavens. Now, as time went on in its never-ending rhythm, it was a reminder of the price of pride and corruption. The chains made a soft noise every time Azazel moved, which barely broke the heavy silence but made his presence known in a subtle way. Each link was a reminder of the complex justice that had bound him, not just as punishment, but also as a way to show how much power he had once had and how badly he had used it. The chains, which glowed with a strange light that seemed to pulse with the memory of his sins, were both physical and spiritual. They held him tight and stopped the corruption from spreading any further. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, and moments seemed to last as long as the long shadows the sun cast on the dunes. In this slow rhythm, every thought, breath, and movement of the fallen angel felt heavy, as if the desert itself were part of the binding, echoing the weight of his fall. Azazel's prison was very quiet and all-encompassing. There were no whispers of the forbidden knowledge he had once taught, no magic or seduction in the still air, just the soft sigh of the wind as it shaped the dunes and carried away the faint traces of past chaos. The desert held him, and in its embrace, he thought about how time passes and how justice never changes. Azazel had been stuck between memory and consequence since the moment he fell. He was both powerful and quiet, as if the world were watching with careful patience. The desert itself felt alive, not in the way that it moved or spoke, but in the deep, almost imperceptible awareness that spread across the endless sands like the quiet tension of his confinement. Sometimes, in the quiet, the chains seemed to hum, a low vibration that carried the echoes of the rebellion, a soft reminder of what had been lost and what had been forced on them. It was as if the very fabric of reality recognized the significance of decisions made in the past, decisions that had disrupted harmony and caused chaos among both humans and angels. The desert was a big, empty space where the listener could think about how lonely Azazel was, both physically and spiritually. Every ripple in the sand and every flash of light across a chain drew me into the story in a gentle way, making me notice how quiet it was after such a huge change in the universe. The desert's silence wasn't just the lack of sound, it was a living echo of what had happened, a quiet voice that spoke without words and carried the weight of eternity. The sands moved as the wind changed direction, making new patterns and briefly revealing pieces of stone and debris that were once part of a world connected to the angels' teachings and the Nephilim's power. These pieces were scattered and half-buried, telling the story of power and destruction without saying a word. There were these quiet signals in the desert that told the listener to lean in and feel the weight of what had happened. The story unfolded slowly and deeply, not in big statements but in small, almost unnoticeable details. The way the chains sparkled in the sun, the way the wind moved across the sand without making any noise, and the way the emptiness made every sound, no matter how faint, seem important. It was a world where the listener's imagination became a friend, filling in the gaps between the chains, the sand, and the silence, creating a tapestry of understanding and compassion for the fallen being. Even though he was chained up and in an endless desert, Azazel was still aware. His silence was tense, and there was a quiet desire that spoke of lost power and the memory of having power. But even this awareness was dulled by the fact that his surroundings were completely out of his control. The desert wasn't just a prison, it was a place to think. Here, every thought, every memory of what had been learned, and every whisper of past rebellion were all limited by God's judgment. The listener, who was drawn into this scene, could almost feel the chain's subtle push and pull, the weight of consequence on every part of life, and how stillness can be just as powerful and compelling as movement. The vast, quiet desert images serve as a backdrop that fully immerses the listener in the story. The emptiness of the space reflects the void left behind after a rebellion, and the chains represent both restriction and the unbroken thread of responsibility. The story doesn't rush. It takes its time with the small details so that the audience can take in the mood, feel the tension, and understand how serious the situation is. The shifting sands, the glint of iron links, and the whisper of the wind all draw the listener deeper into the landscape, where Azazel's presence can be felt and seen. The quiet itself becomes a storyteller, leading the imagination through the complex interplay of punishment, reflection, and memory. As the sun sets over the desert, shadows stretch and mix with the chains, creating a tapestry of stillness and restraint. As the sun goes down, the soft sounds of the chains, the faint hiss of the wind, and the distant echo of the angel's silent life become louder. In this slowly darkening world, the listener is completely surrounded and drawn into the desert's rhythms and the cadence of consequence. The story slows down the heart, makes time seem longer, and is the mind to a meditative place where every detail resonates. The listener feels the vastness, the stillness, and the weight of judgment in this immersive experience. Through it all, the silent, chained figure of Azazel becomes a living presence in their mind, haunting and compelling, yet perfectly still. The desert, the chains, and the deep silence in this sleepy, immersive story all invite the listener to fully enter the story. The subtle movement of the sand, the shine of the chains, and the whispers of the wind all work together to guide the imagination, pull focus, and let you connect deeply with Azazel's world. The story isn't about exciting action, it's about atmosphere, presence, and reflection. The listener drifts through the desert with the fallen angel, feeling the weight of history, consequence, and silent eternity completely absorbed in the story. The tale of Azazel, shackled in the desert, resonates profoundly beyond the ancient realm depicted in the Ethiopian Book of Enoch. When one thinks about his fall, the similarities to how people act today become very clear. War, a frequent motif in human history, reflects the teachings imparted by Azazel in antiquity. Weapons, strategy, and the art of destruction, once forbidden knowledge in the hands of angels, have been adopted, refined, and multiplied by human ingenuity. For hundreds of years, wars have caused nations to rise and fall, and civilizations to be built and destroyed. The unending quest for power and control reflects the teachings Azazel imparted to humanity, illustrating how the misuse of knowledge perpetuates cycles of violence and suffering. This reflection makes it clear that the story is not just about one fallen angel, it is also about the long-lasting effects of making bad moral choices and being too curious. The second area where Azazel's teachings spread through human culture is beauty and adornment, which is just as interesting. From the elaborate jewelry and alluring clothing he brought into the world to the more subtle obsessions with vanity and allure, people still live in a world where looks often take precedence over substance. Fashion, cosmetics, and the social competition around beauty are modern examples of those old lessons. The desire to improve or change how things look can lead to creativity and self-expression, but it can also lead to vanity, obsession, and comparison. Azazel's subtle but persistent influence shows how the search for external perfection can take away from internal integrity, creating desires that can cause social friction, envy, and moral compromise. The listener is encouraged to reflect on how the seeds of ancient knowledge, when separated from wisdom, persist in influencing human priorities and values. The third area of Azazel's influence, magic and manipulation, has also been seen in modern times. Even though ancient magic may not be as common in modern life, people are still very interested in power, control, and things they can't see. Psychological manipulation, persuasion, propaganda, and even the digital algorithms that influence how people think and act are all modern versions of these old ideas. The desire to control outcomes and have an unseen impact is similar to the curiosity and ambition that brought people to Azazel's teachings in the past. This means that the story is not just a historical or mythological one. It is also a way for people to think about their own lives. Our creative and destructive impulses still echo the lessons of responsibility and restraint that are in the story of the fallen angel. If you look more closely, you can see that the main reason Azazel fell, using knowledge wrongly, is still very important. People today have more access to information, technology, and skills than ever before, but using these gifts in an ethical way is still hard. Like the Nephilim and the fall of early humanity showed how sin can have a chain reaction, today's society is dealing with the effects of new ideas without wisdom. There are more moral compromises, more conflicts, and more stress on social structures. The old story becomes a mirror showing the never-ending struggle between potential and responsibility, curiosity and consequence. In this reflection, Azazel is not just a character from the past. He is also a symbol of the moral problems that still affect people's lives. Moreover, the parallels transcend extensive societal trends, penetrating the personal domain of individual choice. Individual desires, be they for power, admiration, or knowledge, frequently resonate with the ancient temptations presented by Azazel. The story is still important because it's so easy for people to get caught up in vanity, manipulation, or ambition. Each individual choice, despite appearing insignificant, influences overarching behavioral trends, akin to how early humans assimilated and responded to the teachings of the fallen angel. The story makes people stop and think about how they deal with desire, curiosity, and power. By linking the old story to how people act today, the listener is asked to think about how choice, knowledge, and moral responsibility are always at work in their own lives. The desert imagery and chains that are so important to Azazel's loneliness also teach us important lessons about the modern world. People aren't physically tied up like he was, but using knowledge wrong, making moral compromises, and letting desire run wild can make invisible chains. Wars, social injustices, and internal conflicts act as metaphorical restraints, influencing lives and communities in ways that resonate with the severity of Azazel's punishment. Thinking about how quiet and still his prison cell is can help you understand the quiet power of being aware, holding back, and thinking. The desert serves as a metaphorical realm, encouraging introspection and recognition of the enduring consequences of actions and teachings. When looking at how people act today, it's clear that these themes, war, an obsession with beauty, an interest in power, and the moral problems that come with knowledge, are all part of everyday life. The ethical quandaries arising from technological progress, the aspiration for status, and the pursuit of power resonate with the ancient teachings found in Azazel's narrative. By looking at these patterns, you can see that the story is timeless. Knowledge and curiosity are gifts, but without a moral foundation, they can lead to temptation, corruption, and chaos. Azazel's fall is a lesson that is still alive today. It reminds us that the choices we make about how we use what we learn shape not only our character, but also the world we live in. This reflection makes the listener think about their own and society's responsibilities in a quiet way. Every instance of modern human conduct, ranging from international disputes to solitary acts of vanity or deceit, functions as a conduit, linking the remote desert chains of Azazel to contemporary times. The story slowly draws the listener into a cycle of reflection, making them aware of the small ways that a desire, ambition, and misuse of knowledge still affect people's lives. The past and present come together to show that Azazel's story isn't stuck in the past. It lives on in the choices, temptations, and moral dilemmas that people face today. This perspective gently guides the listener to comprehend that historical lessons are crucial, as human nature persists with identical impulses, vulnerabilities, and the capacity for both creation and destruction. The story of Azazel, told in soft, immersive tones, is like a mirror to modern life. It shows that even though centuries may go by, the relationship between knowledge, temptation, and responsibility stays the same. The fallen angel's chains, the quiet desert, and the echoes of old sins all tell a story of punishment and also serve as a guiding whisper, urging people to think carefully about how they use their gifts, deal with their desires, and find their way through the moral landscape of their world. The story of Azazel, which is told in the Ethiopian book of Enoch, comes to a gentle end, leaving behind echoes of thought, understanding, and a quiet sense of peace. The story of his fall, from a shining angel of influence to a bound figure in the desert, has taught us lessons that reach every part of our minds. The story of his rebellion, the knowledge he gave to people, the rise of the Nephilim, and the wave of corruption that followed, has all been told in great detail, inviting the listener to follow not only the events, but also the deeper patterns of choice, consequence, and moral reflection. This last part gently shifts the focus from the action to the quiet meaning of the story, giving the listener a sense of closure that is both calming and thought-provoking. At its heart, Azazel's story is a reflection of what it means to be human. The desires, curiosity, and ambition that once led him to forbidden teachings now show the problems that people still face. War, the search for beauty, the lure of knowledge without responsibility, and the effects of subtle manipulation are all things that happen every day, reminding us that the story is never really far away. The listener is drawn into a quiet meditation on ethics, reflection, and the gentle guidance of restraint by seeing what happens as a result of Azazel's choices. The desert imagery, the chain's silence, and the stillness of his imprisonment all set the stage for this thought process, inviting a deep immersion in the story's quiet, reflective mood. The end of the story doesn't need a dramatic ending. Instead, it gives a calm, lasting sense of understanding. Azazel, even though he is bound and fallen, has become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the wrong use of knowledge. His chains are not just tools of punishment, they are also reminders of responsibility. They gently remind the listener that every action has its weight, and that wisdom comes from knowing how to balance potential and responsibility. The desert, which is huge and quiet, is like the listener's own journey through the story. It's a place where imagination and reflection meet, where the lessons of the past sink into the mind with a slow, steady beat, and where the weight of consequence is both acknowledged and understood without fear or worry. A feeling of hope starts to grow as the story comes to an end. Azazel's story is about falling and facing the consequences, but it also shows how powerful choice can be and how reflection and restraint can lead to redemption. The listener is urged to perceive the narrative not merely as a recounting of transgression, but as a lasting lesson that influences everyday existence. When guided by ethics and compassion, knowledge, curiosity, and ambition can help you grow instead of destroy you. In this way, the chains that hold Azazel change from being symbols of punishment to gentle guides. They show the quiet strength of restraint, the need for wisdom, and the lasting importance of moral clarity. The soothing tone of the end invites the listener to be still and take in the story's rhythm and meaning. The desert, the chains, and the faint echoes of past rebellion all become points of meditation, places to think about how grand the celestial story is and how it relates to our lives. The listener is drawn into a space of gentle reflection by letting their imagination settle into these scenes. This is where the story's lessons are naturally absorbed instead of being forced. In this immersion, the story goes from action to understanding and from spectacle to quiet thought, making for a calming experience that is like sleepy storytelling. Azazel's journey, though fraught with insurrection and repercussions, ultimately provides a sense of perspective. It is a story about how things happen because of choices and what happens as a result, as well as how important it is to always be aware of right and wrong. The listener can think about how people act, the moral problems that come with knowledge, and the delicate balance between temptation and restraint by seeing him rise, fall, and be locked up forever. The calm rhythm of the story makes understanding more important than fear, reflection more important than judgment, and insight more important than mere interest. This lets the story stay in the mind as both a story and a meditation. The desert winds softly move across the sands, and the chains shine softly in the fading light. This is a quiet invitation for the listener to stop, breathe, and think about what the story means in a bigger way. The story doesn't end with finality. Instead, it ends with continuity. This is a gentle reminder that ambition, desire, and moral choice are still present in human life. Azazel is now a teacher in a different way, as his life and fall serve as a warning, a symbol, and a way to think about things. The quiet images of the desert and the sound of his chains speak to the listener, creating a feeling of peace, thoughtfulness, and readiness to apply the story's lessons to their own lives. In the end, the story ends with a gentle focus on prayer and hope. After judgment, when things are quiet, there is space for understanding, moral reflection, and the growth of wisdom. The listener feels reassured and quietly encouraged that even when things go wrong or they don't know what to do, they can always think, learn, and act responsibly. A soft prayer, a moment of connection to higher guidance, and a gentle reminder of the ever-present hope and mercy bring the story to a close. The story of Azazel, with all its depth and quiet power, settles into the heart of the listener, leaving an impression that is immersive, reflective, and deeply calming. This shows how powerful storytelling can be in shaping thought, reflection, and moral awareness. In this ending, the story has done its job. It has taken the listener through ancient deserts, the rise and fall of a heavenly being, the quiet places of thought, and finally to a gentle awareness of hope, responsibility, and prayer. The story of Azazel is both a powerful myth and a meditative experience because of the calm, immersive way it is told. The lessons it teaches stay with you long after you've heard them, slowly seeping into your understanding, reflection, and the quiet places in your mind.